Hello, my friends. I hope you're all doing well. Before we begin, I have a small favor to ask. Ranger Screams is going through a difficult time right now, and we truly need your support. Our goal is to reach 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments on this video. If everyone watching leaves a like and writes a comment, we can absolutely make it happen together. It would make a huge difference and help the channel more than you know. Thank you so much for your support. Now get comfortable, and let's begin. The isolation hits you first. That's what nobody tells you about being a park ranger in Navajo Nation territory. The vastness of the landscape swallows you whole, leaving you feeling insignificant against the ancient mesas and endless sky. I've spent 5 years working these lands, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered last month in the remote northeastern section of the park. My name is Daniel Whitefeather. I'm 32 years old, half Navajo on my mother's side, though I was raised mostly in Phoenix by my father after my parents split. I joined the Park Service partly to reconnect with my heritage, partly because I've always felt at home in wild places. Being a ranger suited me. I enjoyed the solitude, the changing seasons, the occasional tourists who needed directions or help with a flat tire. The assignment came on an unseasonably warm October morning. My supervisor, Mark Tallgrass, called me into his cluttered office at headquarters. Maps covered the walls, punctuated by faded photographs of park landmarks and native art. Mark was hunched over his desk, studying a topographical map with unusual intensity. "Close the door, Dan," he said without looking up. I did as instructed, settling into the worn chair across from him. Mark was a full-blooded Navajo in his late 50s, respected throughout the region for his knowledge of the land and its history. He wasn't one for unnecessary conversation, which made his somber demeanor all the more concerning. "We've got a situation," he said, finally meeting my eyes. 3 hikers reported something unusual near Whispering Canyon last week. Then yesterday, a family said their child wandered off trail for less than 5 minutes and came back. Different. Different how? I asked. Mark's weathered face tightened. The parent said the boy was disoriented, speaking nonsense about a person who could change shapes. Said this person promised to teach him magic if he went deeper into the canyon. I nodded, waiting for more details. Cases of children briefly separated from parents weren't uncommon, though the story about a shapeshifter was unusual. "Could be nothing," Mark continued. "Kids have active imaginations. But 2 days ago we found these." He slid a manila folder across the desk. Inside were photographs of large, unusual tracks in mud. They started as what appeared to be human footprints. Then midway through the sequence they changed dramatically, elongated, with clear claw marks at the tips. "What made these?" I asked, unable to identify the animal. Mark hesitated. "I don't know for certain, but they were found less than half a mile from where the boy had his encounter." I studied the photos more carefully. "Mountain lion, maybe? Bears don't have prints like this." "No, they don't." Mark's voice had dropped to almost a whisper. "Look at the stride length. Whatever made these was moving on 2 legs, then dropped to 4. The office suddenly felt colder. Growing up, I'd heard stories from my mother's side of the family, whispered warnings about certain things in the wilderness that shouldn't be named directly. As an adult with a science background, I'd filed those tales alongside other folklore, but something about Mark's demeanor made me uneasy. "I need you to go out there," he said. "Set up camp for a few days. Investigate these reports. Install some wildlife cameras if you can. The official reason is that we're tracking unusual predator activity." "What's the unofficial reason?" I asked. Mark was silent for a long moment. "I need someone I trust, someone with connections to both worlds. Most of the Navajo Rangers won't go near that area now, not after these reports. And the non-native staff, they wouldn't understand what to look for." "And what exactly am I looking for, Mark?" He avoided my question. "Take enough supplies for 5 days. Radio check-ins twice daily. If you don't check in, I'm sending a search team immediately." "You're seriously concerned," I observed. "This isn't just about some strange tracks." Mark opened his desk drawer and removed something wrapped in red cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small leather pouch on a cord. "My grandmother made this," he said quietly. "It contains protective herbs and prayers. Wear it while you're out there." I wanted to smile, to make a joke about superstition, but the gravity in Mark's eyes stopped me. I took the medicine pouch and placed it around my neck. "There are things in this world that exist in the spaces between what we understand," he said. "Things our ancestors knew to avoid. The Dene have survived in these lands for centuries because they respected certain boundaries." "Mark, what exactly do you think is out there?" He shook his head. "I hope nothing. I hope those tracks were made by some injured animal, and the boy simply got scared by shadows. But if you see anything, Unusual. Anything that doesn't seem right. You don't investigate. You leave immediately. Understood? I nodded, though I wasn't sure I did understand. As I stood to leave, Mark added one last instruction. And Daniel? Don't use its name out there. Names have power. If the elders are right about what this might be, speaking about it directly could attract its attention. I drove back to my cabin that afternoon, the medicine pouch heavy against my chest despite its light weight. As I packed my gear for the assignment, I found myself looking up at the window more frequently than usual, unable to shake the feeling that something outside was watching me prepare. The sun was setting as I finished loading my truck. I told myself the assignment was routine. Unusual animal activity happened periodically, and strange tracks often had simple explanations. But as darkness settled over the landscape, I couldn't help but remember the stories my grandmother had told me as a child. Stories I dismissed as I grew older. Stories about things that walked in human skin. The journey to Whispering Canyon took most of the next day. I drove as far as the access road allowed, then hiked the remaining 4 miles with my pack and equipment. The canyon was named for the peculiar way wind moved through the narrow passages, creating sounds that sometimes resembled distant voices. It was beautiful but remote, the kind of place where even experienced hikers could find themselves in trouble if they weren't careful. I established my base camp on a small plateau overlooking the main trail junction. From this vantage point, I could monitor movement in 3 different directions while maintaining radio contact with headquarters. The weather was cooperative. Clear skies, mild temperatures, perfect conditions for tracking. After setting up my tent and organizing equipment, I hiked to the location where the strange prints had been photographed. 5 days of wind and wildlife had erased most signs, but I found one partial impression preserved beneath an overhanging rock. It matched the photos. An unusual hybrid that didn't correspond to any animal I'd encountered in my years as a ranger. I set up 3 motion-activated wildlife cameras in strategic locations and began a methodical survey of the surrounding area. Nothing seemed out of place. Bird calls, insect sounds, and occasional rustling in the underbrush all indicated normal forest activity. Yet I couldn't shake a persistent sense of unease, a feeling that intensified as the sun began to set. That first night I maintained a small campfire and reviewed the day's findings in my notebook. Standard procedure. Everything by the book. I radioed headquarters with my evening check-in, reporting no unusual activity. After signing off, I prepared a simple dinner and settled in with my thoughts. The fire cast dancing shadows across the canyon walls as I sat there, the medicine pouch still around my neck. I thought about my mother, about the fragments of Navajo culture she'd tried to instill in me before my parents' divorce. I remembered how she'd always insisted on certain observances, never whistling at night, never taking anything from sacred sites, never speaking directly of the dead or certain other entities. I was pulled from these reflections by a sound that didn't belong, a high-pitched whine, almost like the cry of an injured animal, but with unsettling human undertones. It came from the darkness beyond my campfire's glow. Somewhere down the eastern trail. I grabbed my flashlight and stood, scanning the perimeter. "Hello?" I called. "Anyone there?" Silence answered me, but the hairs on my arm stood at attention. Protocol dictated that I investigate any signs of distress. A hiker could be injured or lost. But Mark's warning echoed in my mind. I compromised, stepping just beyond the firelight with my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The trail was empty in both directions. Just as I was about to return to camp, the cry came again, this time from behind me, deeper in the canyon where I'd just been looking. Something wasn't right. I retreated to my campfire, added more wood, and retrieved my rifle from the tent. I wasn't trigger happy, but something about that sound struck a primal chord of danger. Wildlife didn't move that quickly or silently, not in this terrain. The night dragged on with no further disturbances. I must have dozed off eventually because I awoke with a start just before dawn, the fire reduced to embers. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind through the canyon walls, just dead air and the first pale light of morning. I stood, stretching my stiff muscles, when movement caught my eye at the edge of camp. A figure stood there, motionless, human-shaped but somehow wrong in proportion. It was watching me. "Hello?" I called, reaching for my rifle. "This is Ranger Whitefeather. Identify yourself." The figure didn't respond. As the light strengthened, I could make out more details. Tall, abnormally thin, clothed in what appeared to be animal hides. Its head was lowered, features obscured. "Sir, you're in a restricted research area," I said with authority I didn't feel. "I need you to identify yourself and return to the marked trails." When it finally moved, the motion was unnaturally fluid. Not the way a person moves, but how an animal might imitate human movement. It turned slowly, revealing not a face but a crude animal mask made from what appeared to be a coyote's head. The empty eye sockets somehow fixed on me. Fear surged through me, but training took over. I raised my rifle to a ready position. "Stop right there. Remove that mask and identify yourself immediately." The figure tilted its head at an impossible angle, as if curious. Then it spoke, a sound like gravel being crushed, forming words that seemed to bypass my ears and materialize directly in my mind. "Skin taker," it said, the syllables stretched and distorted. "You brought me a gift." My blood ran cold. It gestured to the medicine pouch at my chest. "The old ones remember me. Do you?" I fired a warning shot into the air. The report echoed through the canyon, but the figure didn't flinch. "Leave," I commanded, my voice steadier than I expected. Now, a sound emanated from behind the mask. Not laughter exactly, but a rhythmic clicking that approximated amusement. Then it backed away, moving deeper into the shadows between two large boulders. I kept my rifle trained on it until it disappeared from view. Once it was gone, I immediately broke camp, my hands shaking as I packed essential gear. Protocol demanded I report the encounter, but what would I say? That I'd seen a person in a mask who spoke cryptically. That wouldn't justify abandoning my assignment. But every instinct screamed that I needed to leave immediately. As I shouldered my pack, something caught my eye near where the figure had stood. I approached cautiously and found a small arrangement of bones formed into a symbol I didn't recognize. They hadn't been there the night before. I photographed the arrangement, then continued my retreat, hiking quickly toward the trailhead where I'd left my vehicle. The forest felt different now, watchful, hostile. Twice I thought I glimpsed movement from the corner of my eye, but when I turned, nothing was there. I was perhaps a mile from my truck when I noticed the wildlife camera I'd installed the previous day. I stopped to retrieve it, thinking the footage might provide some explanation for what I'd seen. As I removed it from the tree, I heard that same high-pitched whine from the night before, closer now, and from multiple directions. I ran the rest of the way to my truck. Back at headquarters, I downloaded the camera's footage to my laptop, hands still trembling slightly. The rational part of my mind insisted there must be a logical explanation for what I'd encountered. Perhaps a hermit living off the grid, or members of a cult performing rituals in the wilderness. Such things weren't unheard of, especially in remote areas. But as the footage began to play, that rational voice grew quieter. The camera had captured ordinary forest scenes for several hours. A deer passing, small rodents, birds. Then, at 2:17 a.m., the frame filled with a pair of glowing eyes too high off the ground to belong to any local predator. The infrared lighting revealed a humanoid figure standing motionless before the camera, its face a disturbing hybrid of human and animal features. I paused the video, my heart pounding. The face on screen matched what I'd seen at my camp, but without the mask. Elongated features, eyes set too far apart, mouth stretched in an anatomically impossible grin. It wasn't a costume. Whatever this was, it wasn't human. The timestamp showed it had stood there, staring directly into the camera for nearly 6 minutes before moving on. I fast-forwarded through more empty footage until another movement triggered the camera at 4:03 a.m. This time, the figure was on all fours, its body contorted in a way no human spine could manage, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. It paused, seemed to sniff the air, then looked directly at the camera again. Its face had changed, more animal than human now, but still with those same unblinking eyes. I closed the laptop, unable to watch more. My thoughts raced back to my grandmother's stories, to Mark's warnings. The evidence before me aligned with legends I'd dismissed as mere superstition, legends about beings who could take the form of animals or humans at will, beings the Navajo called skinwalkers. I needed to speak with Mark, but when I tried his office, his assistant said he'd left for the day. Instead, I drove to his home, a modest house on the outskirts of the reservation where he lived alone since his wife had passed. He answered the door looking unsurprised to see me. "You came back early. I need to show you something," I said, holding up my laptop. He nodded grimly and invited me inside. We sat at his kitchen table, and I played the footage for him. His expression remained neutral, but I noticed his hand move to touch something under his shirt. His own medicine pouch, I assumed. "Tell me what happened out there," he said when the video ended. I recounted my experience in detail. The crying sound, the figure at my camp, its unnatural movements, and the bone arrangement it had left. Mark listened without interruption, his eyes growing increasingly troubled. "You did right to leave," he said finally. "This is beyond our jurisdiction as rangers." "What jurisdiction would it fall under then?" I asked, frustration edging into my voice. "If this is what I think it is, what you think it is, We can't just ignore it. People use those trails. Mark stood and walked to a cabinet, retrieving an old bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. He poured us each a measure and sat back down. There are protocols for this situation, but they don't come from the Park Service manual, he said. I need to consult with some elders from the tribe. In the meantime, you should take a few days off. Go into town, stay somewhere with people around. I can't just walk away from this, I protested. Whatever I saw is still out there. It's been out there for centuries, Mark replied sharply. The difference is now it's noticed you. That thing you encountered. If it is what we both suspect, it's not just dangerous because of physical harm it might cause. It's dangerous because it corrupts. It influences. The longer you engage with it, the more power it has. So we do nothing? I didn't say that. Mark took a long sip of his whiskey. We do this the right way, with proper precautions and guidance. These beings operate by rules older than our understanding. Breaking those rules has consequences. I drained my glass, the alcohol doing little to calm my nerves. The camera footage will be secured, Mark finished. No copies, no sharing, not even with other rangers. This stays between us for now. I nodded reluctantly. What about the bone arrangement it left? I took photos. Mark's expression darkened. Show me. I pulled up the images on my phone. The bones were arranged in a pattern that resembled a simplified human figure, with small stones placed where eyes would be. It's a summoning sigil, Mark said quietly. Did you disturb it? No, I just photographed it. Good. But this photo? He pointed to my screen. Delete it. Now. I hesitated. It's evidence. It's a conduit, he countered. Images of certain symbols can carry power, especially digital ones that can be endlessly reproduced. Delete it. Against my better judgment, I complied, watching as the image disappeared from my phone. Mark seemed to relax slightly. Go pack some things from your cabin, he instructed. There's a motel in Gallup where you can stay for a few days. I'll call you when I've spoken with the elders. I wanted to argue but could see the firm resolve in his eyes. This wasn't a suggestion, it was an order from my superior. I nodded and stood to leave. At the door, Mark placed a hand on my shoulder. Daniel, listen carefully. Until we know more, there are 3 rules you must follow. First, do not speak directly about what you saw. Not to anyone, not even to yourself when alone. Second, don't let it know you fear it. Fear is an opening it can exploit. And third, most importantly, do not go back to that canyon alone, no matter what you hear or see that might draw you there. What if it follows me? I asked. The question that had been gnawing at me since I fled my campsite. Mark's grip tightened on my shoulder. It might. These beings can develop fixations, but your grandmother's medicine will offer some protection. Keep it with you at all times. I left Mark's house with more questions than answers, driving back to my cabin with a growing sense of dread. The sun was setting as I arrived, painting the landscape in blood-red hues that seemed ominous rather than beautiful. Inside, I quickly packed a bag for a few days away. As I moved through the small space, I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed. Twice I checked windows, finding nothing but my own reflection staring back. I was almost finished when my radio crackled to life. The voice that came through was distorted by static, but recognizable as Jesse Begay, another ranger who patrolled the northern section. Daniel, you there? Over. I grabbed the radio. Here, Jesse. What's up? Over. Just got a report of unusual activity near your sector. Hikers saying they heard someone calling for help near Whispering Canyon Trail Junction. Thought you were still out there. Over. My blood ran cold. Negative, Jesse. I'm back at my cabin. Don't send anyone out there tonight. That area is temporarily restricted for research purposes. I'll explain tomorrow. Over. There was a pause before Jesse responded. Roger that. But these hikers seemed pretty concerned. Said it sounded like a child crying. Over. The high-pitched whine I'd heard. It could easily be mistaken for a child in distress. A lure to draw in potential rescuers. Trust me, Jesse. No one goes out there tonight. Direct authorization from Mark Tallgrass. I'll explain everything in the morning briefing. Over and out. I set down the radio. My decision made. Regardless of Mark's warning, I couldn't risk Jesse or anyone else encountering what I had. I needed to go back, to make sure no other rangers were drawn into this situation. But first, I needed more information. I opened my laptop again and began researching, delving into the legends I'd avoided engaging with seriously until now. The stories varied, but common elements emerged. Skinwalkers were once human, practitioners of a corrupted form of medicine who gained their powers through taboo acts. They could adopt animal forms, mimic voices, and influence the minds of those they encountered. Most accounts describe them as malevolent, drawn to chaos and suffering. According to the legends, they could be warded against with certain herbs and rituals, but they couldn't be easily destroyed. In some stories, speaking their name directly could either summon them or give them power over the speaker. I touched the medicine pouch at my neck, wondering what protections my grandmother had woven into it. I'd need every advantage if I was going back to Whispering Canyon. As night fully descended, I finished packing, not for the motel as Mark had instructed, but for a return to the canyon. I included extra ammunition for my rifle, though I doubted conventional weapons would be effective against what I'd seen. I also packed salt, sage, and a silver knife I kept in my collection, elements mentioned in various accounts as having protective properties. I was preparing to leave when headlights swept across my front window. A vehicle was coming up the access road to my cabin, unusual at this hour. I drew my sidearm and moved to the window, watching as a tribal police cruiser parked beside my truck. Officer Ben Sosi stepped out, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he approached my door. I holstered my weapon and opened the door before he could knock. "Evening, Ben," I said, trying to sound casual. "What brings you out here?" Ben was a solid presence in his uniform, his face grave. "Got a call from Mark Tallgrass. Said you might be thinking of doing something reckless and asked me to check on you." I sighed. Mark knew me too well. "Just preparing for an early start tomorrow." Ben's eyes drifted to my packed gear, clearly ready for an overnight excursion. "Doesn't look like a day pack to me, Daniel." "It's complicated. Usually is." Ben stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "Mark filled me in on some of it. Enough to know you shouldn't be going back to that canyon, especially not at night." I closed the door, frustrated but also relieved not to be facing this alone. "You believe in all this, then? The old stories?" Ben's expression was unreadable. "Let's just say I've seen enough in my years on the force not to dismiss them, especially not on these lands." He settled into my single armchair, making it clear he wasn't leaving anytime soon. "Mark says the elders are gathering tonight. They'll have guidance by morning." "One night, Daniel. You can wait that long." I wanted to argue, to explain about the voice on the radio that might lure others into danger. But something in Ben's steady gaze told me he understood more than he was saying. "Fine," I conceded. "One night." Ben nodded, satisfied. "Good. Now put on some coffee. Looks like we both have stories to share." Dawn broke with a clarity that belied the darkness of the previous night. Ben had stayed until nearly midnight sharing experiences from his 15 years in tribal law enforcement. Incidents that defied conventional explanation, phenomena that aligned with the old beliefs. He never used the term directly, but his meaning was clear. What I had encountered wasn't unique. Others had similar experiences, though few were willing to discuss them openly. I was preparing breakfast when my phone rang. "Mark, with news from the Elders' Council. They've confirmed what we suspected," he said without preamble. "The description, the bone arrangement, the mimicry, it all points to one conclusion. They're sending someone to perform a blessing at the canyon entrance, but that's as far as they'll go." "And what about the trails? The hikers?" I asked. "We can't just cordon off an entire section of the park indefinitely. We're issuing a temporary closure due to predator activity. It buys us some time." Mark paused. "The elders believe this entity has been dormant for many years. Something must have awakened it." "The family with the child," I realized. "The boy who went off trail, possibly. Or it could be tied to recent archaeological work in the eastern section. Some old sites were disturbed." I considered this information while stirring my coffee. "So what's the plan?" "The elders provided some guidance," Mark said. "There's a medicine man who specializes in these matters, John Blackhorse. He lives down near Canyon de Shelley. I'm driving out to meet with him this morning." "I'm coming with you," I said firmly. Mark was silent for a moment. "I expected you'd say that. Meet me at headquarters in an hour." The drive to Canyon de Shelley took most of the morning, the landscape growing increasingly dramatic as we approached. Mark was mostly silent, lost in thought. I used the time to process everything I'd learned, trying to reconcile my scientific training with the supernatural reality I now faced. John Blackhorse's home was a traditional hogan set back from the main road, surrounded by juniper trees. He was waiting for us on the porch as we pulled up, a slender man in his 70s with silver hair pulled back in a neat braid. His weathered face betrayed no emotion as we approached. "The ranger who saw it," he said, nodding at me. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Mark confirmed. "This is Daniel Whitefeather." John's dark eyes studied me intently. "Half-blood," he observed. "Mother's side?" I nodded, uncomfortable with his scrutiny. "Good. The blood remembers, even when the mind forgets." He gestured for us to follow him inside. The Hogan's interior was dimly lit and fragrant with herbs. John motioned for us to sit on woven rugs while he prepared tea over a small stove. The walls were lined with bookshelves containing both ancient-looking volumes and modern scientific texts, an unexpected combination. "You have questions," he said, handing us each a steaming cup. "Ask them now, before we discuss what must be done." I had dozens of questions, but one rose to the surface. "What does it want?" John nodded approvingly. "A good first question. These entities want many things: power, chaos, suffering. But mostly they hunger for essence, spirit, the vital force that animates all living things." "It feeds on people?" I asked, horrified. "Not in the way you're thinking. It doesn't consume flesh. It consumes potential, dreams, futures. When it takes a victim, it's not just taking a life. It's taking all that life might have been." I thought of the family's child, how they said he returned different. Can someone be partially consumed? John's expression darkened. Yes. The entity can attach itself to a victim, feeding gradually. These victims often display personality changes, increasingly erratic behavior. In the old days, such people were sometimes killed by their own families out of mercy. Mark cleared his throat. "The elders mentioned a binding ritual?" "Yes," John confirmed. "Not a destruction. These beings cannot be truly destroyed by mortal means, but they can be bound, returned to dormancy." He fixed his gaze on me. "It requires bait." My stomach tightened. "You mean me?" John nodded. "It has noticed you, formed a connection. That makes you vulnerable, but it also creates an opportunity. The binding requires drawing it to a prepared site where the proper rituals can be performed." "So I'm the lure," I said flatly. "You would not face it alone," John assured me. "I would accompany you, along with others who understand the old ways. But yes, your presence would be necessary." Mark looked troubled. "There must be another way." "There isn't," John said simply. "And time is critical. With each feeding, it grows stronger, more difficult to bind." I sipped the bitter tea, weighing my options. What would this ritual entail? John rose and retrieved a wooden box from a shelf. From it, he removed several small packets wrapped in leather, a vial of dark liquid, and a stone knife with symbols carved into its handle. "The site must be prepared with salt, sage, and juniper in specific patterns," he explained. "Sacred symbols drawn in a mixture of ash and clay. The one who serves as bait must bear markings made with this." He indicated the vial. "When the entity appears, we complete the binding with an offering of blood freely given and words of power that return it to the earth." "Blood?" I repeated. "A small amount, from the willing. It creates a bridge between worlds that the binding can traverse." The rational part of my mind, the part shaped by modern education and scientific thinking, wanted to dismiss all this as elaborate superstition. But the memory of that creature's unnatural movements, its impossible face, silenced those doubts. "When?" I asked simply. "Tonight," John said. "During the dark of the moon. We'll need to reach the canyon before sunset to prepare." I nodded, commitment solidifying within me. "I'll do it." Mark began to protest, but I raised a hand to stop him. "This is my responsibility, Mark. I encountered it first. I have a connection to it now, like John says, and I can't risk it harming anyone else while we debate alternatives." John studied me with newfound respect. "Courage is essential for the ritual to succeed. Fear creates openings the entity can exploit." "I am afraid," I admitted, "but I'll do it anyway." John smiled for the first time. "Then you already have an advantage it won't expect." We spent the next few hours preparing. John explained the ritual in detail, instructing me on the precise words and movements I would need to perform. Mark contacted headquarters to ensure the canyon remained closed and to arrange for Ben Sosi to accompany us as additional security. By late afternoon, we were driving back toward Whispering Canyon, the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon. John sat beside me in the passenger seat, his wooden box of ritual items secure in his lap. Mark and Ben followed in a separate vehicle. "You should know," John said as we neared our destination, "that it will try to deceive you. It may appear as someone you know or trust. It may speak with familiar voices. Do not believe anything you see or hear once the ritual begins." "How will I know what's real?" I asked. "Trust your blood," he replied. "The part of you that is Dine will recognize the truth beneath illusion." We reached the canyon as the day's last light painted the rock formations in gold and crimson. Ben established a perimeter while John, Mark, and I hiked the site I'd chosen for the ritual, a small clearing near where I'd first encountered the entity. John worked methodically, creating a complex pattern of symbols on the ground using colored sands and ash. At the center, he placed a small fire pit lined with stones bearing carved symbols. Around the perimeter, he poured a mixture of salt and herbs in an unbroken circle. Once the ritual begins, do not break this circle, he instructed. No matter what you see or hear, stay within its boundaries until I give the signal. As darkness fell, John painted symbols on my forehead, cheeks, and hands using the dark liquid from his vial. It smelled of iron and herbs, cooling on my skin like mint. He then gave me a small pouch similar to the one from my grandmother. Keep this close to your heart, he said. It contains protections specific to this entity. Mark and Ben took positions outside the circle, rifles loaded with specially prepared ammunition, standard bullets that John had blessed and marked with tiny symbols. I doubted their effectiveness against something supernatural, but their presence was reassuring nonetheless. John lit the central fire, adding bundles of herbs that filled the air with sweet, pungent smoke. He began to chant in Navajo rhythmic words that seemed to vibrate in the earth beneath us. The medicine pouch at my chest grew warm. Now, John whispered during a pause in his chanting, we call it forth. He handed me a small drum made of stretched hide. Beat this. It will hear and come. I took the drum and began a slow, steady rhythm. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, seeming to multiply and return from all directions. John resumed his chanting, his voice rising and falling with the drum beats. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My arms ached from maintaining the rhythm, but I didn't dare stop. The fire cast dancing shadows across the canyon walls, shapes that sometimes seemed to move independently of the flames. Then I heard it, the high-pitched whine I recognized from before, but now coming from multiple directions simultaneously. The sound circled us, drawing closer, then retreating, as if testing our resolve. Keep drumming, John instructed calmly. It approaches. The air grew suddenly colder. The fire's flames turned blue, then an unnatural green. Beyond the circle's edge, shadows deepened and congealed, forming shapes that moved with purpose. It's here, John whispered. Be ready. From the darkness emerged a figure, not the animal masked form I'd seen before, but a woman with long dark hair and familiar features. My mother, exactly as I remembered her from childhood. Daniel, she called, her voice tight with fear. Help me. I'm lost. My drumming faltered, but John's sharp glance reminded me to continue. That's not your mother, he said firmly. Remember what I told you. The figure's expression shifted from fear to rage, its features blurring and reforming into something less human. It circled our boundary, testing for weaknesses. Daniel, it called again, now in Mark's voice. The ritual is wrong. John is deceiving you. Break the circle now, or we're all in danger. I kept drumming, though my hands trembled. John's chanting intensified, the words seeming to physically push against the entity as it prowled. Suddenly, the figure changed again, now appearing as it had when I first encountered it, with its impossible hybrid features and elongated limbs. It snarled, dropping to all fours like a predator preparing to pounce. Now, John commanded. The blood offering. With one hand still drumming, I reached for the stone knife he'd placed beside me. Following his earlier instructions, I made a small cut across my palm, allowing several drops of blood to fall into the fire. The entity shrieked, a sound no human or animal throat could produce. The flames surged upward, momentarily blinding me with their intensity. When my vision cleared, I saw the creature hurling itself against an invisible barrier at the circle's edge, its form fluctuating wildly between human, animal, and something indefinable. John stood, raising his arms toward the night sky. His chanting reached a crescendo, the words no longer seeming like speech but like forces of nature given voice. The ground beneath us trembled. The entity made one final desperate lunge toward me, its features transforming into my own face. Twisted in agony and plea, for a moment our eyes locked, and I felt a horrifying sense of recognition, as if looking into a dark mirror that reflected possibilities rather than realities. Then John brought his hands down in a sharp, decisive gesture. The fire exploded upward in a column of flame that momentarily illuminated the entire canyon. The entity convulsed, its form collapsing inward like smoke being sucked into an invisible container. It screamed, not in pain but in rage, as the earth beneath the circle split open in a narrow fissure. John spoke 7 words in Navajo that seemed to vibrate with power. The entity spiraled downward into the fissure, its form compressing and distorting until it vanished from sight. The crack in the earth sealed itself with a sound like distant thunder, then silence. The fire returned to normal, casting ordinary orange light across our faces. John lowered his arms, exhaustion evident in his posture. Is it done? I asked, my voice hoarse. The binding is complete, he confirmed. It is returned to dormancy beneath the earth. Mark and Ben approached cautiously, their weapons still ready. Did it work? Mark asked. John nodded. For now. The binding will hold for many years, perhaps generations, if the seals remain undisturbed. I looked down at the cut on my palm, deeper than I'd realized in the moment, blood still flowing freely. John took my hand and dressed the wound with herbs and a bandage from his supplies. This will heal, he said, but it will leave a scar, a reminder. Will it come back? I asked. John's expression was grave. Such entities are patient. They exist in a different relationship with time than we do. But as long as the sacred places are respected and the old knowledge preserved, the binding will hold. We broke down the ritual site, John carefully collecting certain items while instructing us to leave others undisturbed. By the time we hiked back to our vehicles, exhaustion had settled into my bones like lead. As we prepared to depart, John took me aside. You should know, he said quietly, that having faced such an entity leaves a mark beyond the physical. You will be more sensitive now to the places where worlds touch, more aware of things others cannot perceive. Is that a gift or a curse? I asked. John smiled faintly. Both, neither. It is simply a truth you must live with. He pressed something into my hand, a small stone carved with protective symbols. Keep this with you. And remember, some stories aren't meant to be shared widely. Choose carefully who you tell about tonight. I nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words. Some experiences defied conventional explanation, existing in the spaces between what modern society acknowledged and what the ancient world knew to be real. As we drove away from Whispering Canyon, I felt changed in ways I couldn't fully articulate, as if I'd glimpsed behind a veil I hadn't previously known existed and could never again pretend it wasn't there. 3 weeks have passed since the binding ritual. Life has returned to a semblance of normalcy, though normal has taken on a different meaning for me now. The canyon has been reopened to hikers after a thorough survey revealed no unusual activity or safety concerns. Mark arranged for additional protective measures, subtle symbols carved into trees at key junctions, blessed objects buried at strategic points along the trails. The cut on my palm has healed into a silvery scar shaped vaguely like a crescent moon. John was right. It serves as a constant reminder of what happened, what I experienced, what I now know exists in the world. I've returned to my regular duties, patrolling trails, assisting visitors, maintaining the delicate balance between human recreation and wilderness preservation. But I move through these familiar tasks with new awareness, attuned to subtleties I previously overlooked. The park feels different to me now. Not threatening, exactly, but alive in ways I hadn't fully appreciated before. I notice patterns in nature that seem to carry meaning. Arrangements of stones, the way certain trees grow. Places where animals refuse to go. I can't interpret these signs with any certainty, but I recognize them as a language I'm slowly beginning to comprehend. John calls me once a week to check on my well-being. We speak in careful terms, never directly referencing what happened, but his guidance has been invaluable as I navigate this expanded perception. He's teaching me protection techniques, ways to shield myself from unwanted awareness when it becomes overwhelming. Mark has become more open about other incidents throughout the park's history. Unexplained disappearances, rangers who quit without explanation, visitors who returned from hikes irrevocably changed. These stories were always there, he explains, but discussed only among those with the context to understand them. I've been invited to attend a council meeting with tribal elders next month, an honor rarely extended to those of mixed heritage like myself. Mark says they want to formally acknowledge my role in the binding ritual and discuss the possibility of training me in traditional protective practices. The nightmares have mostly subsided. In the immediate aftermath, I dream nightly of the entity, its fluid transformations, its hungry eyes, the way it wore familiar faces to deceive me. In the worst dreams, I saw it wearing my own face, using my voice to lure others into danger. I would wake gasping, certain it had somehow followed me home. But John taught me techniques to quiet these visions. Herbs to burn before sleeping, prayers to recite, mental disciplines to separate genuine threats from fears given form in dreams. The medicine pouch from my grandmother remains around my neck, supplemented now with additional protections John provided. Yesterday, I hiked alone to a viewpoint overlooking Whispering Canyon. The landscape stretched before me in breathtaking beauty, red rock formations, juniper forests, the distant glint of water and hidden pools. From this distance, it was impossible to identify the exact location where we performed the binding ritual. As I stood there, a raven landed on a nearby boulder. It watched me with intelligent eyes, head tilted in apparent curiosity. In Navajo tradition, ravens are messengers, sometimes carrying communications between worlds. I nodded respectfully to the bird, acknowledging its presence without presuming to understand its purpose. The raven remained for several minutes, then took flight with a single harsh call that echoed across the canyon. I watched it disappear into the distance, wondering if its appearance held significance or was simply a natural encounter. This is my life now, balanced between two ways of understanding the world. The scientific training that shapes my work as a ranger hasn't been abandoned, but it's been supplemented with older knowledge, deeper awareness of forces that exist beyond conventional explanation. I've begun recording my experiences in a journal, creating a personal account that may someday serve as guidance for others who encounter similar phenomena. I'm careful with my words, following John's instruction to never name certain entities directly, to document without creating inadvertent invitations. Mark has suggested I might eventually take on a specialized role within the Park Service, a liaison of sorts between conventional resource management and traditional knowledge systems. There are sacred sites throughout these lands that require protection not just from physical disturbance but from spiritual intrusion as well. Tonight, as I write these final reflections, I'm sitting on the porch of my cabin. The sky is clear, stars scattered across the darkness like ancient signals. The medicine pouch rests against my chest, warm with familiar energy. A carved stone from John sits beside me on the table, a touchstone to ground me when perceptions become too intense. I am changed by what I experienced. No longer the person I was before encountering the entity in Whispering Canyon. But I don't regret the knowledge I've gained, despite its weight. There is value in seeing the world more completely, in recognizing that reality encompasses more than what can be measured by conventional instruments or explained by current science. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of juniper and sage from the surrounding wilderness. For a moment, I sense something moving at the edge of my awareness. Not a threat, but a presence. A reminder that the natural world has never been as simple or as safe as modern humans pretend. I touch the scar on my palm, feeling its slight raise beneath my fingertips. The binding ritual succeeded, but John's words echo in my memory. Such entities are patient. They exist in a different relationship with time than we do. The skinwalker is dormant now, secured beneath layers of earth and ancient power. But somewhere deep in the canyon it waits, for seals to weaken, for knowledge to fade, for respect to be replaced by careless curiosity. And when that time comes, perhaps generations from now, I hope someone will be prepared to recognize the signs, to understand what walks in the spaces between human comprehension and wilderness truth. Because I used to be a park ranger who believed in a rational, explainable world. Now I'm a guardian who knows better, and even I don't believe the horror I found in those woods. The radio crackled at 3:47 a.m., yanking me from the thin sleep I'd managed in the ranger station. 23 years of answering these calls, and my body still jolted awake like it was the first time. Station 7, we've got a situation at the Whispering Creek trailhead. Campers reporting unusual wildlife behavior. I rubbed my eyes, already pulling on my uniform. Define unusual, dispatch. There was a pause. When Karen's voice came back, it carried an edge I'd never heard before. They're saying an elk is standing on its hind legs, just standing there, watching their tent. I stopped mid-button. In 2 decades of rangering through Montana's backcountry, I'd seen elk do plenty of strange things. Disease, injury, mating season madness. But standing upright? That wasn't in their repertoire. Copy that. En route. The drive to Whispering Creek took 40 minutes through mountain roads that twisted like angry snakes. My headlights carved through October darkness, occasionally catching the reflective eyes of actual wildlife. A fox here, a deer there, all behaving exactly as they should. I found the campsite easily enough. A young couple stood outside their tent, huddled together despite the mild autumn air. They looked at my truck like it was the second coming. Thank God, the woman breathed. It's still out there. I followed her trembling finger toward the tree line. My flashlight beam swept across the pines, finding nothing but shadows and swaying branches. Where exactly? Then I saw it. About 30 yards into the forest, partially obscured by a massive Douglas fir, stood what my brain insisted was an elk. The shape was right, the bulk, the general proportions, but it was vertical. Not rearing up momentarily, not leaning against a tree, standing. Its front legs hung at its sides like arms, and its head was tilted at an angle that made my teeth ache. "Sir?" the man's voice cracked. "What is that?" I kept my voice steady, professional. 23 years of practice. Probably rabies. sometimes affects their motor control. I need you both to pack up and head to the main campground. I'll handle this. They didn't need to be told twice. As their car disappeared down the access road, I approached the tree line, hand resting on my tranquilizer gun. Standard protocol for sick wildlife. Sedate. Tag. Let the wildlife biologist sort it out. The elk, or whatever stood before me, hadn't moved. Its eyes reflected my flashlight with an intensity that made me pause. Normal ungulate eyes caught light in a specific way, a golden-green shimmer. These burned white like stars. Easy there, I murmured, more for my own benefit than the animals. I raised the tranq gun. That's when it smiled. Not a trick of shadow or angle. The elk's mouth stretched wider than any herbivore's jaw should allow, revealing teeth that belonged in no earthly mouth. They were arranged in perfect rows, human-like but far too many, extending back into darkness. My finger froze on the trigger. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but muscle memory from years of training kept me rooted. You don't run from wildlife. You back away slowly. Maintain eye contact. Make yourself large. The thing that wore an elk's shape tilted its head the other way, a movement so fluid it seemed boneless. Then it spoke, not with its mouth. That impossible grin never wavered. The voice came from somewhere deeper, vibrating through my chest like bass from a subwoofer. It used words, but they were wrong. Syllables that human vocal cords shouldn't produce. Ana y nashtoi. Navajo. My grandmother's language, though I only knew fragments. Something about returning or coming back. The accent was perfect, too perfect. Like a recording played through flesh, the elk thing took a step forward. Its hind legs moved with horrible precision, knees bending in the right direction but somehow still wrong. Its front legs swayed as it walked, and I realized they had developed joints where none should exist. I fired the tranquilizer. The dart struck center mass and vanished into its hide. The creature didn't flinch. Instead, its smiling head swiveled to look at where the dart had hit, then back to me. Amused. That's when I ran. Protocol be damned. I sprinted for my truck, boots slipping on pine needles, expecting to feel those wrong teeth in my neck at any second. Behind me came a sound that might have been laughter if laughter could rot. I made it to the truck, slammed it in reverse, and didn't stop until I reached the main road. In my mirrors, nothing followed, just darkness and the memory of that smile. Back at the station, I sat in my office until dawn, writing and rewriting my report. Wildlife incident? Possible rabid elk? Tranquilization attempted, animal fled into forest. Recommended monitoring of area. Every word a lie that tasted like ash, because I knew what I'd seen. My grandmother had whispered about them when I was young, stories her own grandmother had passed down. The Yina Lodlushi, those who walk on all fours. Skinwalkers. I dismissed them as reservation ghost stories. Filed away with La Llorona and the Chupacabra. Even after everything I'd witnessed in these woods, the unexplained disappearances, the sounds that didn't match any known animal, the places where compasses spun wild, I'd maintained my skepticism, but standing there in the pre-dawn quiet of my office, I understood why the old rangers had hollow eyes, why they jumped at shadows, why they all eventually transferred to desk jobs or quit entirely. The woods were full of secrets, and some of them had teeth. 3 days passed before the reports started coming in. I'd hoped, prayed really, that my encounter was isolated. A single incident I could eventually rationalize away, but the morning of October 15th shattered that delusion. Multiple 1054s along the northern boundary. Karen's voice crackled over the radio. 1054 dead livestock. Rancher Thompson's lost 6 head of cattle, says it's the strangest thing he's seen in 40 years. I was already in my truck. Strange how? Better see for yourself. Thompson's ranch butted against parkland. 1,000 acres of scrub and grass where the forest gave way to prairie. I'd answered dozens of his calls over the years. Fence breaches, wandering hikers, the occasional mountain lion. This was different. I could see it in his face when I pulled up. Tom. I nodded. He was standing by his barn, shotgun cradled in his arms like a newborn. Jake? He didn't return the nod. They're in the east pasture. Fair warning, it ain't pretty. He was underselling it. The 6 cows lay in a perfect circle, each one facing outward like spokes on a wheel. No blood, no visible wounds, just dead. Their eyes clouded white and their mouths hanging open in silent screams. Mountain cat? I asked, knowing it wasn't. Tom spat tobacco juice. You ever see a cat arrange its kills in geometry? I circled the carcasses, taking photos for my report. The grass around them was undisturbed. No drag marks, no signs of struggle. They'd simply laid down and died, assuming positions no cow would naturally take. When did you find them? This morning? But here's the thing. They were fine at sundown yesterday. I saw them myself, grazing right here. Whatever did this happened in full darkness. I knelt beside one of the cows, pulling on latex gloves. Its hide was cold but unbroken. No puncture wounds, no claw marks. I pried open its mouth, checking for signs of poisoning. That's when I saw them, tiny holes in the soft tissue of its palate, arranged in a pattern that made my skin crawl. They formed a symbol I recognized from my grandmother's sketches, a thing she'd drawn once and immediately burned. Jake? Tom's voice was tight. You seeing what I'm seeing? I followed his gaze to the center of the circle. The grass there was darker, pressed down in the shape of footprints, human footprints that became hooves, then paws, then something with too many joints. I'll need to contact state wildlife, I said carefully. Maybe CDC. Could be some kind of disease. Tom laughed, bitter and short. Disease, my ass. My grandfather used to tell stories about things like this, back when the Navajo still warned whites away from certain places. He looked at me directly. Your people knew, didn't they? My people. As if my quarter Navajo blood gave me some special insight into the darkness spreading through these woods. But he wasn't wrong. My grandmother had known. She'd tried to teach me the old protections, the ceremonies, the songs, the plants that could ward off evil. I'd been too modern, too educated to listen. I'll file the report, I said. Keep your animals close to the barn for now. Driving back, I made a decision. I pulled off at a service road and hiked 2 miles to a place I hadn't visited in years. The old ranger cache, a supply shed from the 1960s that had been officially decommissioned but never removed. Inside, behind stacks of moldering sleeping bags and rusted tools, was a lockbox I'd hidden there my first year. The journal inside was my secret shame. Every unexplained incident, every story that didn't make it into official reports, every pattern I'd noticed but couldn't prove. 23 years of anomalies, carefully documented and hidden away like a guilty secret. I added the elk thing and Thompson's cattle, then flipped back through earlier entries. The patterns jumped out now that I was looking for them. Livestock deaths in geometric arrangements, hikers reporting animals behaving wrong, the cluster of disappearances every October and March, the areas where radio equipment consistently failed. My hands shook as I traced the incidents on my mental map. They formed a rough circle, maybe 20 miles in diameter, with the center was Crow's Nest Peak, the one place in the park that old-timers avoided, where trails had been mysteriously rerouted in the 1970s, where even the wildlife seemed to give wide berth. I'd been there once 15 years ago. A German hiker had gone missing, and search and rescue had swept every inch of difficult terrain. I'd drawn Crow's Nest, climbing the brutal ascent alone because my partner had called in sick. I'd found the hiker's backpack at the tree line. Nothing else. But I'd felt watched. Not by animals. By something that made my lizard brain scream warnings. I'd marked the GPS coordinates and fled, never mentioning the overwhelming wrongness of the place. Now, staring at my journal, I understood. Crow's Nest wasn't just a mountain. It was a door. And something was using it. My radio crackled. Jake, you there? Go ahead, Karen. We've got a situation. Hiker called in Jesus, I don't even know how to say this. She says she saw her dead husband on the Meadowlark Trail. Says he was walking funny and his face was wrong. I know it sounds crazy. I'm on it. I cut her off. Send me the coordinates. The Meadowlark Trail. 3 miles from Crow's Nest Peak. I locked the journal back in its hiding place and ran for my truck. Whatever was happening, it was escalating. The old rules, the careful balance that had kept the darkness contained for decades, maybe centuries, something had changed. As I drove toward Meadowlark, I caught myself checking the rearview mirror obsessively. Looking for things standing upright that shouldn't be. Looking for smiles too wide, and eyes that burned white. Finding nothing was somehow worse. The hiker was sitting on a boulder beside the trail, arms wrapped around her knees. Mid-40s, expensive gear, the kind of deep tan that came from years of outdoor life. Her name was Sarah Chen, and she'd been completely composed when she'd called dispatch. Now she stared at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. Mrs. Chen? I'm Ranger Morrison. I heard you've had a disturbing encounter. She laughed, high and brittle. Disturbing. That's a word for it. Her gaze focused on me. You're going to think I'm crazy. Try me. She studied my face for a long moment. Whatever she saw there made her shoulders drop slightly. My husband died 8 months ago. Climbing accident on Denali. I scattered his ashes there. It's what he wanted. Her voice grew stronger. I've been hiking our old trails, saying goodbye. Processing. My therapist said it was healthy. I waited. I saw him an hour ago, walking up the trail toward me. For a second I thought I was hallucinating. Grief does things to your brain, right? But he got closer and she shuddered. Take your time. It was wearing his face. His clothes. The same red jacket he wore on our last hike together. But the way it moved. David was graceful. He moved like a dancer on rough terrain. This thing lurched, like someone puppeting a body they didn't understand. My skin prickled. Did it speak to you? It tried, opened its mouth and... God, the sound. Like someone playing a recording backward underwater, but I could almost understand it. It was trying to say my name. What did you do? I ran. She met my eyes, defiant. 20 years of wilderness experience and I ran like a child. It called after me in that broken voice. Then it laughed, and the laugh turned into an elk's bugle, then a wolf's howl, then sounds I don't have names for. I pulled out my notebook, keeping my expression neutral. Can you show me where this happened? She stood immediately. You believe me. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. I've seen things in these woods, Mrs. Chen. Things that don't make it into official reports. We hiked back up the trail, her leading despite visible reluctance. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, creating patches of light and shadow that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Normal forest illusion. Had to be. There, she pointed to a cluster of aspens. It came out from behind those trees. I approached carefully, hand resting on my sidearm. The ground was soft from recent rain, perfect for tracks. I found them immediately, boot prints that matched the tread pattern visible on the hiking boots in the widow's photos of her husband. But the gait was wrong. The spacing suggested someone drunk or injured, dragging one foot and placing the other at odd angles. The tracks led back into the trees for about 50 feet. Then, changed. The boot prints became bare human feet. Then elongated, toes stretching and multiplying. Then something with pads and claws. Then nothing, as if the walker had simply lifted off the ground. Mrs. Chen, I said carefully, I need you to listen very carefully. Don't come back to this trail. Don't hike alone anywhere in the park for the next few weeks. And if you see anything unusual, you call dispatch immediately. You know what it was. Again, not a question. I chose my words like stepping stones across a raging river. There are stories, old stories, about things that can wear the appearance of those we've lost. They're drawn to grief, to places where people have died, to those who walk between worlds in their mourning. Her face had gone pale. Skinwalkers. You're talking about skinwalkers. You know the stories? My college roommate was Daine. She told me things, made me promise never to speak about them. Sarah laughed shakily. I thought she was being dramatic. She wasn't. I handed her my card. My direct number's on there. Anytime, day or night. As we hiked back to the trailhead, I filled her in on the basics. Stay in populated areas. Keep sage and cedar in her pockets. Avoid the park during the new moon. Folk remedies and half-remembered protection rituals, but they were all I had. After she drove away, I returned to the spot where the tracks ended. The air felt thicker there, charged with potential like the moment before lightning strikes. I found myself speaking aloud, words my grandmother had taught me decades ago. A greeting and a warning, an acknowledgement of territory and an assertion of my own right to walk these paths. The forest listened. Then, from somewhere high in the canopy, came a sound like wind through leaves. Except there was no wind. The sound shaped itself into words, in a language older than memory. The door is opening, mixed blood. The abandoned treaty withers. What was bound will walk free. What was sleeping wakes hungry. I stood very still, every nerve screaming. The people still remember the agreements. The boundaries still hold, that not wind laughter again. Do they? Where are your medicine singers? Where are the ones who knew the true names? You carry a badge of the white government and speak of boundaries. The irony is, delicious. A branch cracked overhead. I looked up to see something massive moving through the canopy, shadow against shadow, gone before my eyes could properly focus. But I caught a glimpse of limbs that bent wrong, of fur that shifted like static, of eyes that multiplied and merged. The widow will return, the voice whispered, now coming from ground level, circling me. Grief calls to grief, the dead hunger for the living. And you, guardian who guards nothing, you will watch it all unravel. Then silence. True silence. No birds, no insects, no small mammals rustling in the undergrowth. The absolute quiet of a forest holding its breath. I backed away slowly, maintaining the old forms even though I suspected they were useless. At the trailhead, I finally turned and ran for my truck. As I drove away, my radio exploded with static. Through the white noise, I could hear it, multiple voices, all wrong, all speaking at once. Reports flooding in from across the park. More sightings, more impossible animals, more dead wearing the faces of the living. In my rearview mirror, the forest looked normal, peaceful even, but I knew better. The door was opening, and I was the only one who seemed to understand what that meant. That night, I broke a 20-year promise to myself. I called the reservation, the number I'd memorized but never used. It rang 6 times before a cracked voice answered. "Grandmother," I said in clumsy Navajo, "I need to learn what you tried to teach me. The old protections, the true names, everything." Her silence stretched like a held breath. Then, "It's beginning again, isn't it? After all these years they're walking." "Yes, come home, grandson. Come home before the moon goes dark. There are things you must know, ceremonies you must learn. And Jacob?" "Yes, grandmother?" "Bring weapons. The kind that bite back." The drive to the reservation took 6 hours. I'd called in a family emergency, the first time in my career I'd lied about why I needed time off. Karen hadn't questioned it, she'd sounded relieved. The incident reports were piling up faster than we could process them. My grandmother lived in the same single-wide trailer where she'd raised me after my parents died. The smell hit me as soon as I walked in. Sage, sweetgrass, and something sharper that made my nose twitch. She sat at her kitchen table, looking exactly as she had when I'd left for college. Ageless in the way of those who've made peace with time. "Show me your hands," she said by way of greeting. I held them out. She gripped them with surprising strength, turning them over, studying the palms. Whatever she saw made her click her tongue. "You've touched it. The wrongness. It's in your skin now, calling to them." She released me and gestured to a chair. "Sit. We have little time." The next 3 days blurred together. She taught me things that had no place in the modern world. Songs that hurt to sing, words and languages that predated human speech, rituals involving blood and bone, and substances that shouldn't exist. She showed me her collection hidden beneath the trailer's floorboards, weapons that looked decorative but hummed with purpose, bullets carved with symbols that made my eyes water, blades of volcanic glass that seemed to cut the air itself. "Your great-great-grandfather was a keeper," she explained, cleaning an impossible rifle that seemed to be made of petrified wood and meteor iron. "Before the treaty broke the first time, before the government came with their papers and promises, he walked the boundaries, kept the bargains, fed the things that needed feeding to keep them sleeping." "What treaty?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand. She gave me a look that could peel paint, the one your textbooks don't mention. When the first humans came to this land, it was already occupied. Not by people, by older things. Things that wore shapes like clothes, that hungered in ways we couldn't comprehend. Our ancestors made agreements, boundaries, rules, and those rules are breaking down. "Broke," she corrected. Past tense. What you're seeing now is just the first cracks becoming visible. The real breach happened years ago, when the last singers died, when the ceremonies stopped, when people like you, she pointed accusingly, stopped believing. I wanted to protest, but she was right. I'd run from this knowledge, buried it under science and regulations and the comfortable lie that the world was explainable. "The mountain," I said. "Crow's Nest Peak, that's where they're coming through." Her face went very still. "You've been there?" "Once. 15 years ago. And you survived." "Interesting." She stood, joints popping like firecrackers. "Then that's where we go, you and me, to reseal what can be sealed, to bargain for what can be bargained for. To fight if necessary." "Grandmother, you're 90 years old." She moved faster than thought, the blade appearing at my throat before I could blink. "Age is just one way of measuring time, grandson. I've been preparing for this longer than you've been alive. The question is, are you ready?" I thought about the elk thing's smile, about Sarah Chen's dead husband walking, about the cattle arranged in their perfect circle. "No, but I'm going anyway." She smiled then, showing teeth. "Good. Honesty might keep you alive." We spent the last night preparing. She painted symbols on my skin with ink that burned cold, wrapped protection bundles in leather pouches, loaded weapons with ammunition that shouldn't exist. As she worked, she told me the real history of the park, of the boundaries drawn not on maps but in blood and promise. "The things that walk on all fours," she said, "they're not evil. Not in the way humans understand evil. They're hungry. They exist to consume, to wear, to become. In the old days, we fed them carefully, controlled offerings. Animals prepared with ceremony. Sometimes, she paused, sometimes volunteers. Those who were dying anyway, who chose to feed the hunger rather than let it range free. Human sacrifice. Sacrifice implies loss. This was trade, balance, a few lives to save thousands. Her hands never stopped moving, weaving materials I couldn't identify into shapes that hurt to perceive directly. But your modern world doesn't believe in balance. It believes in control, in conquest. And so the hungry things grow hungrier. We left before dawn, my truck loaded with supplies that would have gotten me arrested if anyone had looked closely. The drive back to the park felt like descending into a mouth. The closer we got, the thicker the air became, pregnant with possibility and dread. I'd been gone 4 days. In that time, the situation had deteriorated beyond recognition. The park was officially closed, something that had never happened in its history. National Guard units were stationed at the entrances, but I knew the back roads, the service paths that didn't appear on public maps. We entered through the northern boundary, where the forest grew thick and old. My grandmother sat in the passenger seat, rifle across her lap, singing under her breath in a language that made my teeth ache. The trees seemed to lean away from us as we passed. "They know we're coming," she said conversationally. "They're curious. It's been so long since anyone came to bargain properly." The radio, which I'd turned off, suddenly crackled to life. Static resolved into voices, dozens, hundreds, all speaking at once. I could pick out fragments, my name, my grandmother's name, names of rangers who died years ago, names in languages that had never been human. "Turn here," my grandmother commanded. I pulled off onto a trail that didn't exist on any map, that I'd never seen despite knowing every inch of the park. The truck lurched over exposed roots and stones, climbing steadily toward Crow's Nest Peak. The sun, which had been rising, seemed to stop. The light grew thick and amber, like old honey. We stopped at a clearing I remembered but couldn't possibly remember. It wasn't there before. In the center grew a tree that made my eyes water. It was every species at once, its bark shifting between pine and oak and something that might have been flesh. Things hung from its branches. Some were recognizable, antlers, skulls, ranger badges spanning decades. Others defied description. "The offering tree," my grandmother said. "The anchor point. This is where we make our stand." As if her words were a signal, the forest exploded with movement. They came from every direction, things that crawled and walked and flowed. I saw the elk creature from my first encounter, but it was just one of dozens. Hundreds. They wore every shape imaginable, animals that walked upright, humans with too many joints, shadows that had gained substance, and behind them all, something vast that I couldn't look at directly, something that might have been the mountain itself given hunger and form. My grandmother stepped out of the truck, moving with terrible purpose. She began to sing louder now, her voice carrying impossible distances. The thing stopped their advance, listening, waiting. The bargain was broken. She called out in English, in Navajo, in tongues I didn't recognize. "But I am here to renew it, to offer terms, to feed the hunger in the old ways." The response came from everywhere and nowhere, a voice like continents grinding together. "The old ways are dead. The singers are gone. The blood is thin. We hunger, and the world is ripe for feeding." My grandmother laughed. Actually laughed. "The blood is thin? Then let me show you how thin blood can still bite." She moved. At 90 years old, she moved like lightning, like wind, like something that had never been human at all. The rifle in her hands roared, firing bullets that left trails of light. Where they struck, things screamed and dissolved. Her other hand held a blade that seemed to cut reality itself, leaving wounds in the air that bled darkness. But there were too many. For every one that fell, 3 more took its place. They pressed closer, their impossible anatomies becoming more twisted, more hungry. "Jacob," she shouted. "The tree? You have to complete the circuit." I didn't understand, but my body moved anyway. I ran for the offering tree, pulling out the bundle she'd prepared. As soon as I touched the bark, knowledge flooded in, not my grandmother's teachings, but older memories, genetic memories. How to sing the binding songs, how to open veins and let blood flow in the correct patterns, how to offer pain and fear and mortality to things that had never known death. I bled onto the roots. I sang until my throat went raw. I carved symbols that my conscious mind couldn't comprehend. And slowly, impossibly, the tide turned. The creatures began to slow, to solidify into single shapes instead of constant flux. The vast presence behind them withdrew slightly, no longer pressing against the boundaries of what was real. My grandmother appeared beside me, covered in substances I didn't want to identify. "Good," she panted. "Now comes the hard part. The negotiation. I thought we were already. Fighting is easy, grandson. Now we have to talk terms with things that see us as food. Things that have been starving for decades. We have to convince them that controlled feeding is better than a free feast." She was right. It was harder. The negotiation took place in a space between spaces, where time moved in spirals and words had weight like stones. I spoke for the human world, my grandmother translated, and the hungry things made their demands. They wanted blood, yes, but more than that, they wanted recognition, acknowledgement, to be fed with intention rather than accidentally through ignorance and disbelief. By the time we reached an agreement, the sun had set and risen 3 times, though my watch insisted only hours had passed. The terms were complex, written in scars on my skin and in dreams I'd have for the rest of my life. But the core was simple: the old ways would return. Not human sacrifice, but animal offerings prepared with ceremony. Certain areas of the park would be closed permanently, given over to them, and there would need to be keepers again, watchers who walked the boundaries. "I'm too old," my grandmother said as we drove away from Crow's Nest Peak, the truck's engine coughing like a dying animal. "This was my last fight, but you have the blood, the training now, the sight. You can teach others, rebuild what was lost." I thought about my life as a ranger, my modern life with its reports and regulations. "I don't know if I can do this." "You will," she said simply, "because the alternative is worse. You've seen them hungry. Do you want to see them loose?" 6 months later, I stood at the entrance to what used to be the Meadowlark Trail. The sign now read, "Area closed for ecological restoration, no entry." It was one of 17 trails we'd permanently shut down, creating a buffer zone around Crow's Nest Peak. The official story involved protecting sensitive wildlife habitat. The real story was written in the scars on my arms and the silver streaks that had appeared in my hair overnight. The real story walked on too many legs in the spaces between trees, fed now, but always hungry. Sarah Chen stood beside me. She'd returned, as the voice in the forest had predicted, but not as prey. After her encounter, she'd sought answers with the same determination that had made her a successful wilderness guide. When I'd put out quiet word that I needed people who could see, who could walk boundaries without flinching, she'd been the first to volunteer. "How many this month?" she asked, checking the offerings in her pack. 6 rabbits, prepared according to my grandmother's instructions, their blood mixed with herbs that grew in no garden, their bones carved with symbols that hurt to create. 12 sightings, 3 attempted crossings. 1, I paused. 1 successful possession, a hiker who ignored the closure signs. We found him 3 days later, wearing his own face badly. Had to use the old weapons. She nodded, professional. The work had hardened her, as it had hardened me. We were the new keepers, walking the ancient boundaries with modern boots. There were 7 of us now. Former military, indigenous wisdom keepers, even a quantum physicist who'd had her own encounter and couldn't rationalize it away. We met monthly, sharing knowledge and scars, building a new tradition from the ashes of the old. The park had reopened, officially. Tourism was down, word spreads, even when newspapers won't print certain stories. But those who came now were different, more respectful, more aware, as if some primitive part of their brains recognized that these woods had teeth again. "Ready?" I asked Sarah. She shouldered her pack. "Let's feed the hungry dark." We hiked in silence, following paths that didn't exist on maps. At the first offering site, a natural stone circle that predated human presence, we began the ritual. Blood on stone, songs in languages we were still learning, the careful placement of flesh and bone. They came as they always did, sliding out of spaces between shadow and light. The elk thing was often first, its impossible smile now familiar as an old adversary. It took its portion with something that might have been gratitude, if gratitude could rot. "Keeper," it spoke, its voice like grinding glass. "The hunger ebbs, the treaty holds, but others wake. Older hungers, deeper throats. The mountain dreams of walking." I kept my voice steady. "We'll deal with them as we dealt with you. One boundary at a time." It laughed, that sound like breaking birds. Perhaps the mixed blood has iron enough. But the world grows thin, the walls between weaken with each passing season. What will you do when the mountain itself decides to feed? I didn't answer, couldn't answer, but I continued the ritual, the offerings, the songs, building patterns of protection one ceremony at a time. After the creatures had fed and withdrawn, Sarah and I hiked back in the gathering dusk. The forest felt not safe. It would never feel safe again, but balanced, held in check by bargains and blood. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Your old life, when you could pretend the world was simple?" I thought about it. About reports filed in triplicate and regulations that made sense. About nights when I slept without dreaming of too many teeth. About a time when elk were just elk. "No," I said finally. "That life was a lie. This," I gestured at the darkening forest, at the shadows that moved with purpose. "This is true. Terrible and hungry and strange, but true." My radio crackled. "Jake, we've got a situation at the northern boundary. Campers reporting something. Can't make sense of their description." "On my way," I responded. Then, to Sarah, "Want to come meet the new recruits?" She smiled, checking her ammunition. "The special rounds, carved with binding runes. Always. Someone has to teach them which nightmares bite and which ones just threaten." We headed for my truck, leaving the offering site behind. In the trees, things with too many eyes watched us go. Waiting. Always waiting. But fed. For now. The treaty held. The boundary stood. And somewhere in the dark, my grandmother's spirit walked with us, teaching us songs we'd never fully understand, preparing us for hungers we'd never fully satisfy. But we kept walking. Keep feeding. Keep the balance, because the alternative, a world where the hungry things walked free, where the mountain itself might rise and feed, was too terrible to allow. I'd been a park ranger for 23 years when I learned the forest had teeth. Now, I was something else, something older, something necessary, a keeper of boundaries, a feeder of the dark, a singer of binding songs. And despite everything, despite the scars and the nightmares and the knowledge that could never be unlearned, I'd never felt more like I was exactly where I needed to be. The woods were full of secrets, full of hunger, full of things that should not be. But now, finally, they also had guardians who understood. The old treaty was dead, but the new one, written in blood and nightmare and the iron will of those who refused to let the darkness win, that treaty would hold. It had to, because I'd seen what happened when it didn't, and I would feed every monster in these woods myself before I let that happen again. Few experiences compare to the sensation of being watched in the wilderness. It's primal, a tingling at the base of your skull, a tightening in your chest. Every ranger knows the feeling. Usually it's just wildlife, a curious deer or perhaps a mountain lion tracking from a distance. This felt different. After hearing those wood knocks near the abandoned campsite, I drew my service weapon and performed a careful sweep of the immediate area. Finding nothing, I continued toward Eagle Summit, following what appeared to be a hasty trail left by the missing hikers. They had abandoned the established path, suggesting they were either lost or fleeing something. About a mile further, the forest changed character. The pines grew denser, and less sunlight penetrated the canopy. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees. I came across more broken trees, some over a foot thick, snapped like twigs. The pattern appeared deliberate, almost like territorial markers. The air carried an unusual odor, musky and pungent, similar to wet dog but far more intense. Any experienced backcountry ranger recognizes animal scents, but this was unfamiliar. I documented everything meticulously. If I was tracking what I thought I might be tracking, I wanted evidence. Throughout my career, I'd heard the stories. Every ranger stationed in the Pacific Northwest eventually encounters tales of Sasquatch. Most of us treated them as campfire myths, something to humor tourists with while emphasizing actual wildlife safety. But we also whispered about the unexplained incidents. Rangers who quit after certain assignments, unusual reports that disappeared from records, areas of the park that experienced staff avoided. Near a small stream crossing, I found their backpack, a high-end hiking model containing a camera, water filter, and trail mix. The zipper was torn open, contents partially spilled. Nearby, a trekking pole lay bent at an impossible angle. Whatever had happened here had happened fast. I photographed everything and collected what I could carry. The camera was intact, and I scrolled through the most recent images, scenic shots of the trail, selfies of a smiling couple, and then a series of blurred photos taken in rapid succession. The final image made my breath catch, a dark, massive shape partially visible behind a cluster of trees. The photo was too indistinct to identify what I was seeing, but the proportions were all wrong for a bear or any known wildlife. I radioed dispatch with my coordinates and findings, careful to stick to observable facts without speculation. "Dispatch, this is Lookout Ridge. I've located some personal items belonging to our missing hikers about 5 miles northeast of their last known location. Signs of possible wildlife interaction. Continuing search. Copy, Lookout Ridge. Any indication of what direction they headed? I studied the ground. Tracks suggest they continued uphill, off-trail, possibly toward Blackwater Ridge. There was a pause before dispatch responded. Be advised, Blackwater Ridge is outside your usual patrol area. We can dispatch backup from the eastern station to meet you. Negative. That would take at least 8 hours. If they're injured, time is critical. Another pause. Understood. Proceed with caution and maintain regular radio contact. As I continued tracking, I recalled conversations with Henry Blackwood, an elderly ranger who'd retired the year before I started. During a training patrol, he'd taken me to a remote ridge and pointed to a valley so densely forested it appeared as a dark green sea. There are places in these woods the tribes never settled, he'd said quietly. Places where the hunting is good, water is plentiful, but they still wouldn't go. When colonizers asked why, they spoke of territories belonging to the Tall Ones or the wild people of the forest. Sounds like superstition until you spend enough seasons out here. I'd laughed it off then. Now, following a trail of broken vegetation and unusual tracks toward Blackwater Ridge, his words returned with uncomfortable clarity. Late afternoon brought me to a steep ravine. The trail left by the hikers indicated they had descended in a hurry. Sliding marks suggested they'd lost footing several times. At the bottom ran a small creek, and on the far bank I found a single hiking boot, women's size 8, its laces torn. As I examined it, I noticed something on a nearby tree. Clumps of dark hair snagged on the rough bark about 8 feet up. It wasn't bear fur or anything I recognized. I collected samples in an evidence bag. The fading daylight warned me I had perhaps an hour before navigating would become treacherous. I needed to make a decision, continue following the increasingly disturbing trail or establish a camp and resume at first light. Standard procedure dictated making camp, but nothing about this situation felt standard. I was about to radio dispatch when I heard it. A human voice, distant but distinct, calling for help from somewhere deeper in the ravine. Without hesitation, I headed toward the sound, my flashlight already in hand as shadows lengthened around me. In the growing darkness, I failed to notice the massive footprint where I'd been standing, or the fact that it was freshly made, pressed into the mud after I had passed that spot the first time. Something had circled behind me. The human voice echoed through the ravine again. A woman's voice, hoarse with fear or exhaustion. Help! Is anyone there? Please! I quickened my pace, following the creek downstream. The ravine narrowed and the vegetation grew thicker, forcing 7 years into my career as a wilderness ranger at North Cascades National Park. I've learned that the most unsettling aspect isn't the isolation or the wildlife. It's the profound quiet that occasionally descends when even the birds stop singing. Rangers call it the hush. It's when the forest holds its breath, and experienced outdoorsmen know to pay attention. I was stationed at Lookout Ridge Outpost, one of the most remote ranger cabins in the Pacific Northwest. My district covered nearly 60 square miles of pristine wilderness, ancient forests of Douglas fir and western hemlock, alpine meadows and rugged mountain terrain. Cell service was non-existent, and my only regular contact was a scheduled radio check-in every morning and evening with dispatch. The job description was straightforward: maintain trails, assist hikers, enforce regulations, monitor wildlife, and occasionally conduct search and rescue operations. What they don't mention in training is how the isolation reshapes your perception. After weeks alone, the forest becomes more than scenery. It becomes a presence. My cabin was rustic but functional. A one-room structure with a wood stove, small kitchenette, desk for paperwork, and a narrow bed. The walls were decorated with topographical maps, wildlife identification charts, and a few personal items. On my bookshelf sat dog-eared copies of field guides, regulations, and a worn paperback of Algernon Blackwood's The Wendigo, a horror novel about wilderness entities that a fellow ranger had given me as a joke during training. Something to keep you company on those long nights, he'd said with a wink. I never admitted how unsettling I found it, especially during winter storms when the wind howled through the pines like voices. That particular summer had been unusually busy with a record number of hikers on the trails. By late August, I was looking forward to the off-season quiet. Then the radio crackled to life one evening as I was preparing dinner. Lookout Ridge, this is dispatch. Come in. I grabbed the handset. This is Lookout Ridge, go ahead. We've got a potential situation. 2 hikers missed their check-in at Maple Creek Trailhead. Last known location was heading toward Eagle Summit yesterday morning. Family reports they were supposed to exit today but never showed. I glanced at my watch. 7:45 p.m. Darkness would fall within an hour. Copy that. I'll gear up and head toward Eagle Summit first light. Any other details on the hikers? Male and female, mid-30s, experienced. They reported seeing unusual activity on the trail to another hiker who exited this morning. Unclear what that means. Unusual how? Hiker said they mentioned finding large footprints in broken trees. Thought they were being followed. I felt a chill despite the warm evening. 10-4. I'll radio when I reach the summit trail junction. After signing off, I pulled out my maps and began planning the search road. Eagle Summit was about 9 miles from my cabin, a 5-hour hike through increasingly remote terrain. As I studied the topography, my eyes drifted to the bookshelf where Blackwood's novel sat. The cover showed a dark figure looming among shadowy trees. That night, I dreamed of footprints too large to belong to any known animal in these woods. I woke before dawn and packed efficiently. First aid kit, extra water, emergency supplies, flares, GPS, and my service weapon. Rangers rarely carried firearms, but in the backcountry with potential predators, it was standard procedure. The first signs of trouble appeared 3 miles in. I found a campsite hastily abandoned, a tent still standing with sleeping bags inside, cooking equipment scattered as if left mid-meal. More disturbing were the trees surrounding the site. 3 massive pines had been broken, not cut but snapped about 8 feet up, their tops dangling or thrown several yards away. No bear or windstorm does damage like that. I documented everything with my camera and radioed dispatch with an update. Then I noticed the ground around the perimeter of the camp. The soft earth held impressions that made my skin prickle. Footprints nearly 18 inches long, deeply pressed into the soil as if made by something incredibly heavy. I'd seen plenty of hoaxes during my career, tourists creating big footprints as a joke. These were different. The stride length was over 6 feet. The impression showed clear toe marks and a natural gait pattern that would be nearly impossible to fake. I knelt to examine them more closely when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong in these woods. From somewhere deeper in the forest came 3 distinct wood knocks, like someone striking a tree with tremendous force. Then silence. The forest had gone completely still. The hush had fallen, and I knew I wasn't alone. 7 years into my career as a wilderness ranger at North Cascades National Park, I've learned that the most unsettling aspect isn't the isolation or the wildlife. It's the profound quiet that occasionally descends when even the birds stop singing. Rangers call it the hush. It's when the forest holds its breath, and experienced outdoorsmen know to pay attention. I was stationed at Lookout Ridge Outpost, one of the most remote ranger cabins in the Pacific Northwest. My district covered nearly 60 square miles of pristine wilderness, ancient forests of Douglas fir and western hemlock, alpine meadows, and rugged mountain terrain. Cell service was non-existent, and my only regular contact was a scheduled radio check-in every morning and evening with dispatch. The job description was straightforward: maintain trails, assist hikers, enforce regulations, monitor wildlife, and occasionally conduct search and rescue operations. What they don't mention in training is how the isolation reshapes your perception. After weeks alone, the forest becomes more than scenery. It becomes a presence. My cabin was rustic but functional. A one-room structure with a wood stove, small kitchenette, desk for paperwork, and a narrow bed. The walls were decorated with topographical maps, wildlife identification charts, and a few personal items. On my bookshelf sat dog-eared copies of field guides, regulations, and a worn paperback of Algernon Blackwood's The Wendigo, a horror novel about wilderness entities that a fellow ranger had given me as a joke during training. "Something to keep you company on those long nights," he'd said with a wink. I never admitted how unsettling I found it, especially during winter storms when the wind howled through the pines like voices. That particular summer had been unusually busy with a record number of hikers on the trails. By late August, I was looking forward to the off-season quiet. Then the radio crackled to life one evening as I was preparing dinner. "Lookout Ridge, this is dispatch, come in." I grabbed the handset. "This is Lookout Ridge, go ahead. We've got a potential situation. 2 hikers missed their check-in at Maple Creek Trailhead. Last known location was heading toward Eagle Summit yesterday morning. Family reports they were supposed to exit today but never showed." I glanced at my watch, 7:45 p.m. Darkness would fall within an hour. "Copy that. I'll gear up and head toward Eagle Summit first light. Any other details on the hikers?" Male and female, mid-30s, experienced. They reported seeing unusual activity on the trail to another hiker who exited this morning. Unclear what that means. Unusual how? Hikers said they mentioned finding large footprints in broken trees. Thought they were being followed. I felt a chill despite the warm evening. 10-4, I'll radio when I reach the Summit Trail junction. After signing off, I pulled out my maps and began planning the search route. Eagle Summit was about 9 miles from my cabin, a 5-hour hike through increasingly remote terrain. As I studied the topography, my eyes drifted to the bookshelf where Blackwood's novel sat. The cover showed a dark figure looming among shadowy trees. That night, I dreamed of footprints too large to belong to any known animal in these woods. I woke before dawn and packed efficiently. First aid kit, extra water, emergency supplies, flares, GPS, and my service weapon. Rangers rarely carried firearms, but in the backcountry with potential predators, it was standard procedure. The first signs of trouble appeared 3 miles in. I found a campsite hastily abandoned, a tent still standing with sleeping bags inside, cooking equipment scattered as if left mid-meal. More disturbing were the trees surrounding the site. 3 massive pines had been broken, not cut, but snapped about 8 feet up, their tops dangling or thrown several yards away. No bear or windstorm does damage like that. I documented everything with my camera and radioed dispatch with an update. Then I noticed the ground around the perimeter of the camp. The soft earth held impressions that made my skin prickle. Footprints nearly 18 inches long, deeply pressed into the soil as if made by something incredibly heavy. I'd seen plenty of hoaxes during my career. Tourists creating big footprints as a joke. These were different. The stride length was over 6 feet. The impression showed clear toe marks and a natural gait pattern that would be nearly impossible to fake. I knelt to examine them more closely when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong in these woods. From somewhere deeper in the forest came 3 distinct wood knocks, like someone striking a tree with tremendous force. Then silence. The forest had gone completely still. The hush had fallen, and I knew I wasn't alone. To push through dense underbrush, my radio crackled with static as dispatch attempted contact, but the terrain was interfering with transmission. I kept moving. The voice called once more, closer now, and I responded, "National Park Service? I'm coming to help. Keep calling out." Silence followed then. "Oh, thank God. We're here." By the fallen tree ahead, I could make out a massive fallen cedar spanning the creek. As I approached, my flashlight beam revealed a woman huddled against the trunk. She was dirty, her clothes torn, and her face scratched, but otherwise appeared uninjured. She shielded her eyes against the light. "Rachel Keller?" I asked, recalling the name from the missing persons report. She nodded frantically. "Yes, you have to help us. My husband." "Where is he?" She pointed upstream. "In a cave. He can't walk. His leg..." "Something attacked us." I radioed dispatch, getting only fragmented response through the interference. I relayed our coordinates as best I could and requested medical evacuation. "What attacked you, Rachel?" Her eyes widened. "We thought it was a bear at first. It destroyed our camp. We ran, but it followed. Not like a normal animal. It was hunting us. Deliberately." "Did you see it clearly?" She shook her head. "Just glimpses. Huge. Walking on 2 legs. We thought someone was playing a prank at first, but then..." She broke off, shuddering. "It makes these sounds, not animal sounds. Almost like words." I helped her to her feet. "Can you show me where your husband is?" She nodded and led me about 50 yards upstream to a shallow cave formed by a rock overhang. Inside, a man lay on his side, pale and sweating. His right leg was crudely splinted with broken branches and strips torn from a backpack. "Mark? I found help. A ranger." He looked up, relief washing over his face. "Thank God. It hasn't come back?" I knelt beside him, examining the injury without disturbing the splint. "What happened to your leg?" It grabbed me, pulled me. I heard the bone snap. His voice was flat, shocked. "Rachel got me away when it was distracted by something. We've been hiding since yesterday afternoon." I administered first aid, giving him water and painkillers from my kit. The fracture was serious, but not immediately life-threatening. Moving him, however, would be challenging without a proper rescue team. "I'm going to set up emergency shelter," I explained. "The cave is defensible, but we need better protection. I'll start a small fire too. The smoke might keep wildlife away." Rachel exchanged a look with her husband. "Will it keep that thing away?" I chose my words carefully. "I need you to tell me exactly what you saw." Mark's voice lowered. "We were setting up camp when we heard tree knocks. 3 in sequence, then repeated. We thought it might be other hikers signaling. Then we found footprints, massive ones, fresh. That night, something circled our camp just outside the light. We could hear it breathing," Rachel continued. "In the morning, we packed to leave, but it started breaking trees around us, like it was showing what it could do. We ran, but it herded us off the main trail." "Herded you?" I asked. Mark nodded grimly. It wasn't trying to catch us at first. It was driving us somewhere specific, toward this ravine. That's when I fell and it grabbed me. I've dealt with bear attacks, mountain lion encounters, and every manner of wilderness emergency. Nothing in my training covered this scenario. Yet their description matched dozens of accounts I'd dismissed throughout my career. As I set up a small fire near the cave entrance, I recalled an obscure protocol mentioned during my advanced wilderness training. Incident Code 1607, Procedures for Encounters with Unclassified Bipedal Humanoids. The protocol was presented almost as a joke, buried among legitimate emergency responses. Most rangers assumed it was a relic from the 1970s when Bigfoot fever had swept the Pacific Northwest, but the protocol existed nonetheless, and it recommended 3 specific actions: maintain consistent light and noise, avoid aggressive posturing, and establish a perimeter with specific markers. Using branches and cord from my pack, I constructed crude tripods at 20-yard intervals around our position, hanging my spare bandanas from each. The protocol didn't explain why, but it was explicit about this step. As darkness settled completely, the forest grew unnaturally quiet again. No insects chirping, no night birds calling. The hush had returned. "It's coming back," Rachel whispered, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond our fire. Mark struggled to sit up. "You have a gun, right? You need to use it." I kept my voice calm. "Let's not escalate unless absolutely necessary." That's when we heard it. A series of vocalizations from the darkness. Not animal growls or calls, but something disturbingly close to language. Deep, resonant sounds that seemed to form patterns. 3 distinct sequences repeated. The hair on my neck stood up as the implications hit me. It wasn't just hunting. It was communicating, and somewhere in the darkness beyond our fire, something responded. We weren't dealing with one creature. There were multiple. I drew my weapon and positioned myself between the hikers and the darkness, hoping dispatch had understood enough of my broken transmission to send help, because for the first time in my ranger career, I wasn't sure I could protect the people in my care. The night stretched endlessly as we huddled in the makeshift shelter. I maintained the fire, feeding it regularly to ensure constant light and warmth. Mark drifted in and out of consciousness, his leg badly swollen despite my first aid efforts. Rachel sat vigilant, jumping at every sound from the darkness. The vocalizations continued intermittently, deep, resonant calls echoing through the ravine, sometimes close, sometimes distant, as if the entities were coordinating. Occasionally, we heard heavy bipedal movement in the underbrush, circling our position but never approaching the fire directly. "Why don't they just attack?" Rachel whispered around midnight. "They clearly outnumber us." I had been wondering the same thing. "I don't think they want to attack. If they did, they would have by now." "Then what do they want?" I had no answer based on conventional wildlife management training. But I recalled stories from my conversations with Henry Blackwood and local tribal representatives who occasionally consulted on park management. Tales of forest people who were territorial but not necessarily malevolent, unless provoked. "I think we're in their territory," I said finally, "and they want us to know it." Around 2 a.m., something changed. The vocalization stopped abruptly. The forest fell into absolute silence for nearly 10 minutes. Then we heard it, the sound of heavy objects being placed around our perimeter. Thuds and scrapes as things were arranged in the darkness just beyond our firelight. When dawn finally broke, I saw what they had done. Arranged in a perfect circle around our position, just beyond the markers I had placed, were dozens of tree branches, pine cones, and stones, not randomly scattered but carefully positioned in patterns. 3 stones, then a branch, then 3 pine cones, repeated with precision. "They're communicating," I murmured, photographing the arrangements. Rachel stared at the patterns. "It looks like writing." I nodded slowly. The systematic arrangement did resemble a form of symbolic communication, but what message were they conveying? With daylight providing better visibility, I decided to scout the immediate area while Rachel stayed with Mark. I followed the creek downstream, looking for easier extraction routes for when rescue arrived. About 200 yards from our shelter, I found something that stopped me cold. A structure stood in a small clearing, an intricate arrangement of branches and saplings woven together to form what could only be described as a shelter. Too sophisticated for any known animal behavior, yet clearly not human-made either. The entrance was roughly 8 feet tall. Inside, the ground was covered with a bed of moss and ferns. More disturbing were the items carefully arranged at the entrance. A collection of man-made objects, an old boot, rusted tin cans, a frayed backpack patch from the 1980s, and most alarmingly, several Park Service trail markers from various decades. They had been collecting our artifacts. studying us. I photographed everything and hurried back to the cave. As I approached, I heard Rachel screaming. Two figures stood at the edge of our camp, massive, hair-covered forms silhouetted against the morning light. They stood fully upright, at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and powerful limbs. Their faces were obscured in shadow, but I could make out the gleam of eyes watching intently. I froze, hand moving slowly toward my sidearm. One of the figures made a deep, rumbling sound and pointed to the bandanas marking our perimeter. Then it deliberately placed another arrangement of stones and sticks beyond the marker. I understood suddenly. They were acknowledging the boundary I had established, responding to it. The protocol had worked as designed, not to ward them off, but to establish communication. "Rachel," I called softly. "Don't move. Don't show fear." The creatures watched silently as I slowly approached the camp. When I reached Rachel, she grabbed my arm, trembling. "What are they?" she whispered. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But I don't think they want to hurt us now." The larger of the two beings made another vocalization, a complex series of sounds that seemed directed at me. Then, with deliberate movements, it placed something on the ground at the edge of our camp. "Mark's missing camera," a gesture I couldn't misinterpret. A return of property. Before I could react, both creatures turned and moved into the forest with surprising grace for their size, disappearing within seconds despite their bulk. Rachel stared at the spot where they had stood. "Did that just happen?" I nodded, retrieving the camera. "They're more intelligent than we've ever given them credit for." Inside the cave, Mark was awake and agitated. I heard Rachel scream. "What happened?" I showed him the camera. "I think we've been misunderstanding the situation. They weren't hunting you. They were trying to figure out what you were doing here." Mark looked skeptical. "Broke my leg." "Yes," I acknowledged. "But it could have done much worse. I think your presence surprised them, and they responded defensively. Once they recognized you weren't a threat, they began trying to communicate." I checked my radio again, finally getting a clear signal. Dispatch confirmed a rescue team was en route and would reach us by mid-afternoon. Until then, we needed to maintain our position. As we waited, I reviewed the photos on the recovered camera. Most were as expected. Hiking shots, landscapes, wildlife. But the final images, taken just before the attack, showed something remarkable. A juvenile Sasquatch partially visible in the underbrush, watching the hikers with evident curiosity. The adult creatures hadn't been hunting the hikers. They had been protecting their young. The rescue team arrived at 3:42 p.m. 2 rangers and a wilderness paramedic I'd worked with before. They brought a portable stretcher for Mark and additional supplies. Their expressions were professionally neutral as I briefed them on the wildlife encounter. But I noticed their eyes scanning the forest edge continuously. "You reported code 1607. Senior Ranger Wilson asked quietly while the paramedic attended to Mark. I nodded. "You know what that means?" Wilson's weathered face revealed nothing. "Officially? Unclassified wildlife interaction?" "Unofficially." He glanced around before continuing. "This isn't the first call like this we've had this season. Something's changing in these woods." The paramedic declared Mark stable for transport but confirmed my assessment. A clean fracture requiring proper medical attention. The extraction would be challenging, requiring us to carry him up the steep ravine before reaching terrain where a helicopter evacuation would be possible. As we prepared to move, I noticed Rachel staring intently into the forest. "They're still watching us," she said matter-of-factly. I followed her gaze but saw nothing. Still, I felt it too, that prickling sensation of being observed. "Do you believe us?" she asked. "About what we saw?" I carefully documented the arrangements of stones and sticks in my official report. "Yes. And you're not the first." The journey out was arduous. Carrying Mark's stretcher up the ravine required all 4 of us working in careful coordination. Rachel followed behind, occasionally stopping to look back over her shoulder. About halfway to the extraction point, we heard it again. Those distinctive wood knocks, 3 in sequence, echoing through the trees. The rescue team paused, exchanging glances. "Just a woodpecker," Wilson said loudly, unconvincingly. We continued upward, but the atmosphere had changed. The forest felt charged with unseen presence. Twice we heard heavy movement paralleling our path, staying just out of sight. Near the top of the ravine where the forest thinned slightly, I glimpsed movement. A massive dark figure moving with surprising grace between distant trees, not hiding anymore but escorting us to the edge of their territory. At the extraction point, a small clearing large enough for a helicopter to hover, we set up a temporary camp to await aerial evacuation. The weather had turned, with low clouds threatening to delay the helicopter. We might need to spend another night in the wilderness. As twilight approached, Wilson pulled me aside. "You encountered them directly, didn't you?" Saw them up close. I hesitated, then nodded. They displayed intelligence, communication. They returned the hiker's camera. Wilson was silent for a long moment. There's a briefing when we get back. Special Division personnel. They'll want your full report. Special Division? I've never heard of that. They don't advertise. They document these encounters. Have been for decades. He lowered his voice. What you saw today, it's happening more frequently. As human activity pushes deeper into the last remote areas, contact is becoming inevitable. The implications were enormous. The public doesn't know? Wilson gave a humorless laugh. What would we tell them? That there's an undocumented, intelligent, non-human species living in North American forests? The scientific community would demand specimens. Hunters would flood the wilderness. These creatures would be killed or captured within months. He was right, of course. I thought of the careful boundary markers, the returned camera, the protection of their young, actions showing a complex understanding I couldn't fully comprehend. As darkness fell, the forest around us erupted in a cacophony of wood knocks and vocalizations, dozens of them, in complex patterns from all directions, not threatening, but unmistakably communicative. The rescue team tensed, hands moving to their sidearms. Stand down, I ordered. They're not attacking, they're talking to each other. For nearly 20 minutes, the sounds continued. A symphony of calls, responses, knocks, and whistles. Then, as suddenly as it began, silence fell. Rachel had been listening intently. It's beautiful, she whispered. Like a language. Wilson's radio crackled. The helicopter was delayed until morning due to weather. We would spend the night at the extraction point. As we established our camp, something unexpected happened. From the darkness, a heavy object landed with a thud at the edge of our clearing, then another, and another. Branches. Freshly broken, aromatic pine branches ideal for bedding and shelter. They were helping us. Throughout the night, we maintained watches in pairs. During my shift with Wilson, he shared what he knew, that the Park Service had documented hundreds of encounters over decades, that certain areas were informally recognized as their territory, and that experienced rangers developed an unspoken understanding, mutual avoidance and respect. Why isn't this common knowledge, I asked. Even among rangers? Wilson shrugged. Would you have believed it before today? Most incidents get filed as unusual bear activity or territorial disputes. We keep the peace by keeping the secret. Before dawn, something approached our camp. A solitary figure, massive and silent. I tensed, but Wilson put a restraining hand on my arm. The creature stepped to the very edge of our firelight. For the first time, I saw one clearly. Over 8 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown hair, with a face that was simultaneously alien and eerily familiar. Intelligent eyes studied us from beneath a heavy brow ridge. It made no threatening moves. Instead, it simply observed, with what I could only interpret as curiosity. After several minutes of mutual observation, it deliberately placed something on the ground. A bundle of medicinal herbs recognizable to any wilderness first responder, yarrow, plantain, and wild ginger, all useful for treating inflammation and pain. Then it melted back into the darkness. Wilson exhaled slowly. 23 years as a ranger and I've never seen one that clearly. What do we do with this? I asked, meaning not just the herbs, but the entire encounter. Wilson considered for a long moment. That's what the briefing is for. But I can tell you this. What happens in these woods, stays in these woods. As dawn broke, we heard the approaching helicopter. Our time in their territory was ending, but I knew I would carry this encounter with me forever, reshaping everything I understood about the wilderness I had sworn to protect. 3 days after the rescue, I sat in a windowless conference room at regional headquarters. Mark Keller was recovering in hospital, his fracture requiring surgery but expected to heal fully. Rachel had been debriefed separately the previous day. The room contained 4 people. Myself, Senior Ranger Wilson, a Park Service administrator I'd never met named Dr. Elaine Foster, and a solemn man who introduced himself only as Mr. Collins from the Department of Interior. On the table before us lay my photographs, field notes, and official incident report, alongside a thick folder stamped, classified, Incident Classification 1607. Ranger, Dr. Foster began. Your report details direct visual contact with multiple bipedal non-human primates. You're certain about what you witnessed? Absolutely, I replied. We observed at least 2 adults and evidence of a juvenile. They displayed tool use, complex communication, territorial behavior, and what appeared to be cultural transmission of knowledge. Mr. Collins opened the classified folder. Your experience aligns with approximately 350 documented encounters across North American wilderness areas since 1943. The patterns are remarkably consistent. He spread photographs across the table, dozens of footprint casts, hair samples, and strange arrangements of sticks and stones identical to what I'd documented. What we're discussing doesn't officially exist, he continued. The department maintains a small research unit documenting these encounters, but our findings remain classified. Why? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Dr. Foster responded. Confirmation would trigger immediate scientific and public interest. These beings, whatever they are, would face unprecedented pressure. Habitat encroachment, research expeditions, trophy hunters. Based on population estimates, they would face extinction within a generation. Wilson nodded grimly. We protect the wilderness and everything in it. Sometimes that means protecting certain truths about the wilderness, too. Mr. Collins slid a document across the table, a non-disclosure agreement. Your official report will reflect an encounter with an unidentified large mammal, possibly a bear. The details you've provided will be incorporated into our research database, but not public records. I stared at the agreement. You're asking me to lie? We're asking you to help protect perhaps the most significant undocumented species on our continent, Dr. Foster said softly. Just as you would protect any endangered species. She opened a laptop and played a recording. Vocalizations identical to what I'd heard in the forest. This was captured in Olympic National Park, 1976. We've documented regional variations suggesting distinct cultural groups or possibly dialects. These aren't simple animals, they're intelligent beings with social structures we barely understand. The implications were staggering. How many rangers know about this? A small percentage, Wilson answered. Those with direct encounters or those like me who've been around long enough to see the patterns. Most prefer not to talk about it even among ourselves. Mr. Collins closed the folder. The indigenous peoples of these regions lived in equilibrium with these beings for thousands of years. They understood something we're only beginning to grasp. Some knowledge is best preserved through discretion rather than documentation. I thought of my experiences in the forest, the returned camera, the offered herbs, the careful boundary markers. These weren't the actions of mindless beasts, but of intelligent beings with their own society. What happens if I sign? You'll be offered specialized wilderness assignments, Dr. Foster explained. Areas where interactions have been documented. Your observations will contribute to our understanding while helping maintain the equilibrium that allows both our species to coexist. I signed the document. That was 5 years ago. Since then, I've been stationed in some of the most remote regions of the national park system. I've documented dozens of interactions, cataloging communication patterns, territorial markers, and behavioral variations between regional populations. I've observed tool use, primitive medicine, and possibly even artistic expression in carefully arranged forest structures. My official reports mention none of this. Instead, I've become part of an unofficial network of rangers, researchers, and indigenous knowledge keepers who share information through cautious channels. We monitor habitat encroachment, divert hiking trails away from sensitive areas, and occasionally spread just enough strange wilderness stories to keep the curious at a respectful distance. The forest keeps its secrets, and we help it do so. Sometimes, on quiet nights in my remote cabin, I hear wood knocks in the distance. 3 in sequence, then repeated. A boundary check. A reminder of territories respected. I've learned to respond with my own pattern, tapping my walking stick against a tree trunk. Acknowledgement. Respect. The wilderness manual doesn't prepare you for such things, but the forest itself, if you listen closely enough, teaches you everything you need to know. They were here long before us, these shadows and the pines. With proper stewardship, they'll remain long after. That, after all, is the true meaning of conservation. Preserving not just what we understand, but what we have yet to understand. Protecting not just the wilderness we know, but the wilderness still shrouded in mystery. Some truths belong to the forest, and in the forest they should remain. The radio crackled to life at 5:47 a.m., jolting Marcus Rivera from his fitful sleep in the ranger station bunk. Static filled the small room before Deputy Chief Henderson's voice cut through. Rivera, we've got hikers overdue on the Bright Angel Trail. Supposed to check in yesterday evening. Marcus rubbed his eyes and reached for the handset. In his 8 years as a Grand Canyon Park Ranger, he'd seen enough missing persons cases to know the statistics weren't encouraging. The Park Service maintained cold case files going back decades, and Marcus had memorized too many names of people who'd simply vanished into the vast wilderness. Copy that. How many in the party? 3 college kids from Phoenix. Left Tuesday morning for a 2-day backcountry permit. Parents called when they didn't show for dinner plans last night. Marcus was already pulling on his uniform. The early October air carried an unseasonable chill that made his skin prickle. He'd grown up in Arizona, knew the desert's moods better than most, but lately the canyon felt different, heavier, like it was watching. I'll head out in 20. Send me their permit details. Already sent. And Rivera? Be careful out there. We've had some strange reports from that sector lately. The line went dead before Marcus could ask what kind of reports. 40 minutes later, Marcus stood at the trailhead where the missing hikers had begun their descent. The Bright Angel Trail stretched down into the canyon's depths, a thin ribbon carved into ancient rock faces. Solo hikers like these three were statistically more likely to become the subject of search and rescue operations, but something about this case felt off even before he'd started looking. Their vehicle, a blue Honda Accord, sat exactly where it should in the overnight parking area. No signs of forced entry, no indication they'd ever returned to it. Marcus checked the interior through the windows, water bottles on the seats, a GPS device charging in the console, college textbooks scattered in the back. Everything suggested they'd planned to come back. The trail registry showed their signatures. Sarah Chen, 21, ASU, Tyler Brooks, 22, ASU, Jamie Valdez, 20, ASU. Sarah's handwriting was neat, precise. Tyler's was a hasty scrawl. Jamie had drawn a small smiley face next to her name. Marcus shouldered his pack and started down the trail. The October sun climbed higher, but the canyon walls seemed to swallow the light before it could warm the path. His boots found their rhythm on the well-worn switchbacks, the familiar sound of gravel and dust marking each step. 2 miles down, he found their first campsite. The fire ring showed recent use, charred wood scattered in the center. But the campsite was too clean. No trash, no forgotten items, no tent stakes driven into the ground. It looked like they'd policed their area meticulously before leaving, or like someone else had cleaned up after them. Marcus knelt by the fire ring, running his fingers through the cold ashes. Mixed in with the burned wood, something caught his eye. Tiny fragments of what looked like bone, but burned too thoroughly to identify. He collected samples in an evidence bag, though protocol dictated he shouldn't assume foul play yet. The trail continued deeper into the canyon, winding between towering rock formations that cast long shadows even in full daylight. Marcus had hiked this route hundreds of times, but today each turn felt unfamiliar. The silence pressed against his eardrums. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals in the brush. Even the wind seemed muted. At the 3-mile marker, he found Tyler Brooks' baseball cap. It hung from a dead tree branch about 8 feet off the ground. The ASU logo faded but still visible. The tree was completely barren, leafless and white, its branches reaching up like skeletal fingers. The cap hadn't blown there. The branch was too thick, the fit too precise. Someone had placed it there deliberately. Marcus photographed the scene from multiple angles before climbing up to retrieve the cap. As he stretched to reach it, his radio squawked. "Rivera, this is Henderson. What's your status?" 3 miles down Bright Angel. Found some evidence. Their campsite was sanitized, and I just found a baseball cap hanging about 8 feet up in a dead tree. Hanging? You mean caught on a branch? Negative. Placed. Someone put it there. Marcus climbed down with the cap. "This doesn't feel like a standard search and rescue anymore, Chief." Static filled the silence before Henderson responded. "Continue your sweep, but don't go past the 5-mile marker alone. I'm sending backup." Marcus clipped the radio back to his belt and examined the cap more closely. No tears, no blood, no obvious signs of struggle. But inside the crown, barely visible, someone had scratched words into the fabric liner with a fingernail or small blade. "Help us." The canyon walls seemed to lean inward as Marcus continued down the trail. His breathing felt labored, though the descent shouldn't have been difficult for someone in his condition. With each step, the feeling grew stronger that he was being observed from the shadows between rocks, from the dark crevices that honeycombed the canyon walls. 4 miles down, the official trail curved to the right, but an unmarked path branched off to the left, disappearing behind a massive boulder formation. Marcus had hiked Bright Angel dozens of times and had never noticed this offshoot. According to his GPS, it wasn't marked on any Park Service map. He was debating whether to investigate when he heard it, a sound that made every muscle in his body tense, a low, rumbling call that echoed off the canyon walls, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't quite animal, wasn't quite human. The sound lingered for several seconds before fading into the oppressive silence. Marcus drew his sidearm and thumbed off the safety. In 8 years of ranger work, he'd encountered bears, mountain lions, rattlesnakes, and aggressive elk. He'd broken up fights between drunk tourists and talked down suicidal hikers, but he'd never heard anything like the sound that just echoed through the canyon. His radio crackled again. "Rivera, did you copy that sound? You heard it at the station?" "Negative. But we just got a call from a helicopter tour group. Their pilot reported hearing something unusual coming from your sector. Described it as a roar, but not from any animal he recognized. Marcus felt sweat beating on his forehead despite the cool air. I'm at the 4-mile marker. There's an unmarked trail branching off here. No record of it on any maps. Do not pursue unknown trails alone, Rivera. Wait for backup. But as Marcus stood at the junction, staring down the mysterious path, he spotted something that made his blood run cold. 20 feet down the unmarked trail, scattered on the ground like breadcrumbs, were personal items. A cell phone, a water bottle, a small day pack with flowers embroidered on it. Chief, I've got their gear down the unmarked trail. I'm going to take a closer look. Rivera, that's a direct order. Wait for. Marcus switched off his radio and started down the unmarked path. The unmarked trail was narrower than any official park path, barely wide enough for single-file hiking. Whoever had carved it into the canyon wall had done so recently. Marcus could see fresh tool marks in the sandstone, and the path showed signs of regular maintenance. But it appeared on no maps, had no trail markers, and violated numerous Park Service regulations about unauthorized trail development. The scattered gear belonged to the missing students. Marcus photographed each item before collecting it. Sarah's iPhone, cracked but still functional. Tyler's Camelback hydration pack, still half full. Jamie's small day pack containing granola bars, sunscreen, and a worn paperback novel. The items formed a trail leading deeper into a part of the canyon Marcus had never seen. The walls here were different from the main Bright Angel corridor. Instead of the familiar striated red and orange sandstone, these rocks showed darker veins, almost black streaks that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the filtered sunlight. The geology looked wrong, like this section belonged to a different mountain range entirely. Marcus checked his GPS. According to the device, he was standing in solid rock. The satellite couldn't get a clear reading on his actual position, showing him as somewhere impossible, inside the canyon wall itself. He tapped the screen, thinking it might be malfunctioning, but the readings remained consistent. Technologically speaking, he didn't exist. The trail continued to descend at a steep angle, switchbacking down toward what appeared to be a hidden canyon within the larger canyon system. Marcus had studied topographical maps of this area extensively during his ranger training, but no such formation appeared in any official documentation. It was as if someone had hidden an entire geological feature from the outside world. 50 yards down the trail, Marcus found evidence of the students' overnight camp. But this wasn't like the sanitized site on the main trail. This camp showed signs of a hurried, panicked departure. A tent had been left partially collapsed, one corner weighted down by rocks as if the occupants had tried to secure it against strong winds. Sleeping bags were scattered across the small clearing, one with what looked like claw marks raked across the nylon fabric. Most disturbing was the fire ring. Unlike the clean ashes at their first campsite, this one contained partially burned items that clearly belonged to the students. Fragments of clothing, melted plastic that might have been gear, and something that made Marcus's stomach clench: human hair. Long brown strands that matched Sarah Chen's photo, singed but not completely burned. Marcus collected samples, his hands shaking slightly as he worked. 8 years of law enforcement training had taught him to maintain objectivity, to follow evidence rather than emotion. But standing in this hidden canyon with the smell of burned hair still faint in the air, objectivity felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. The trail continued past the camp, descending toward what appeared to be a natural amphitheater carved into the canyon floor. Marcus could see structures down there, not natural rock formations, but what looked like deliberate constructions, low walls, possibly built from stacked stones, dark openings that might be cave entrances. The scale was difficult to judge from his position, but the settlement, if that's what it was, appeared to cover several acres. Marcus tried his radio again, but got only static. He was completely cut off from the outside world, following a trail that didn't officially exist toward structures that shouldn't be there. Every instinct told him to turn back, to climb up to the main trail and wait for backup. But the evidence trail led downward, and 3 college students were missing. He continued his descent. The path grew more treacherous as it approached the canyon floor. Loose scree shifted under Marcus's boots, and several times he had to grab the canyon wall for balance. The rock face felt oddly warm to the touch, almost body temperature, though the air remained cool. As he drew closer to the structures, details became clearer. The low walls were indeed built from stacked stones, but the craftsmanship was unlike anything Marcus had seen in southwestern archaeology. The stones fit together with precision that seemed almost organic, as if they'd grown into position rather than been placed by human hands. No mortar held them together, yet the walls appeared solid and weatherproof. More disturbing were the cave entrances. From a distance, they'd appeared to be natural formations, but up close Marcus could see they'd been deliberately expanded and shaped. Tool marks scored the walls around each opening, but the tools used had left patterns unlike any conventional implements. The marks looked more like claw scratches, deep gouges in the sandstone that would have required tremendous force to create. Tales of wildmen or unusual humanoid creatures were familiar in almost all parts of the country, so it wasn't entirely surprising that such things might be suspected in missing persons cases. But Marcus had always assumed such stories were either hoaxes or misidentified wildlife. Standing at the edge of this hidden settlement, he began to question those assumptions. The largest cave entrance was directly ahead, maybe 15 feet high and nearly as wide. Dark stains marked the stone around the opening, not mineral deposits, but what looked like old blood stains. Recent scratches in the dirt led from the main path directly to this entrance, as if something heavy had been dragged inside. Marcus drew his sidearm and approached the cave mouth. The smell hit him first, a mixture of decay and something else. Something animal but not quite identifiable. It reminded him of the reptile house at the Phoenix Zoo, but stronger and more complex. He clicked on his flashlight and peered into the darkness. The cave extended much deeper than he'd expected, the walls opening into a vast underground space. His light beams seemed to be absorbed by the darkness rather than illuminating it, revealing only small patches of the interior at a time. But in those brief glimpses, Marcus saw enough to confirm his worst fears. Scattered across the cave floor were personal belongings that didn't match the missing student's gear, backpacks in various stages of decay, clothing that looked like it had been there for years, and bones, human bones, weathered white and arranged in careful piles along the cave walls. The first documented disappearance in this area dated back to 1974, and since then hikers and campers had vanished with alarming regularity. Marcus was looking at the remains of decades of missing persons, all collected in one place like trophies. A sound from deep in the cave made him freeze. Not the rumbling call he'd heard earlier, but something else. A scraping noise, like claws on stone, moving closer. Marcus backed away from the cave entrance, his gun trained on the darkness. The scraping grew louder, accompanied by a rhythmic breathing that seemed too deep and too slow for any normal animal. Whatever was in the cave was large, and it was aware of his presence. He turned and ran. Marcus scrambled up the treacherous trail, loose rocks cascading down behind him with each hurried step. The scraping sound from the cave had stopped, replaced by something worse: silence. Whatever lived in those depths wasn't pursuing him in any obvious way, but Marcus could feel its attention like a physical weight between his shoulder blades. His breathing came in ragged gasps as he climbed. The unmarked trail that had seemed merely steep during his descent now felt almost vertical. Sweat stung his eyes despite the cool air, and his legs burned with the effort of rapid ascent, but the terror driving him forward was stronger than physical exhaustion. Behind him, echoing off the canyon walls, came that rumbling call again. Closer now, much closer. It reverberated through the rock beneath his feet, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. Whatever made that sound wasn't confined to the caves. It was mobile, and it was hunting. Marcus paused at a switchback to catch his breath and check his progress. The hidden settlement was still visible below, but from this angle he could see details that had been obscured during his approach. The structures weren't abandoned ruins. Smoke rose from several of the cave entrances, and he could make out movement in the shadows. The place was very much inhabited. His radio remained dead, showing no signal bars despite his increased elevation. The GPS still placed him inside solid rock, as if the electronic world refused to acknowledge this hidden canyon's existence. Marcus was completely isolated, cut off from backup, tracking evidence of multiple homicides in terrain that officially didn't exist. The trail curved around a massive boulder, temporarily blocking his view of the settlement below. As Marcus rounded the stone formation, he came face to face with proof that he was no longer alone on the trail. Footprints in the soft dirt, but not human footprints. These were larger, longer, with distinct claw marks at the end of each toe. The stride length suggested something that walked upright but took steps nearly twice as long as an average person. The prints were fresh. Dust hadn't yet settled into the impressions, meaning whatever made them had passed this way within the last few minutes. Marcus photographed the tracks with his phone, though he doubted the images would be clear enough for analysis. The prints led up the trail in the same direction he was heading, toward the junction with the main Bright Angel Trail. Whatever had made them was moving faster than he was, despite the difficult terrain. A new sound drifted down from above. Not the rumbling call, but something that made Marcus's blood freeze. Human voices, calling for help. Young voices, scared and desperate. "Help us! Please, somebody help us!" It was definitely Sarah Chen's voice, though strained with terror. Marcus could hear Tyler and Jamie as well, their voices echoing off the canyon walls from somewhere up ahead. They were alive, but in immediate danger. Marcus pushed his exhaustion aside and increased his pace. The students' voices grew louder as he climbed, but there was something odd about the acoustics. The voices seemed to come from multiple directions, bouncing off the rock walls in patterns that didn't match the canyon's layout. It was as if the calls were being deliberately amplified and redirected. The trail straightened for a long stretch, giving Marcus a clear view ahead. What he saw made him stop dead in his tracks. About 100 yards up the trail, the three missing students stood in a tight group. They appeared unharmed from this distance, though their clothing was torn and dirty. They were facing away from Marcus, calling out toward the main trail junction, apparently unaware of his presence behind them. But they weren't alone. Standing just to the side of the trail, partially concealed by shadows between the rock formations, was something that Marcus's rational mind struggled to process. It was tall, much taller than any human, with proportions that seemed fundamentally wrong. Arms that hung too low, reaching nearly to the ground. A torso that was too broad and too thick. And the way it stood, perfectly motionless while the students called for help just yards away, suggested an intelligence that was calculating and patient. Marcus raised his weapon, though he was still too far away for an accurate shot. Through his iron sights he could see more details of the creature. Its skin appeared to be dark, possibly covered in coarse hair or fur. The head was large and elongated, with what might have been elongated facial features, but the most disturbing detail was its behavior. It was clearly aware of the students' presence but was making no move to harm them. It was waiting for something. Marcus began moving up the trail again, trying to close the distance while keeping his weapon trained on the creature. But as he moved, he realized what it was waiting for. The students' calls for help were bait, designed to draw other hikers into the area. The creature was using them as lures. "Sarah," Marcus called out, breaking cover. "Tyler, Jamie, this is Park Ranger Rivera. Move away from the rocks." The three students spun around, their faces lighting up with relief when they saw his uniform. But their movement had triggered something in the creature. It shifted, stepping fully into view, and Marcus got his first clear look at what had been hunting in the canyon for decades. The creature was humanoid but wrong in fundamental ways. Too large, too muscular, with features that suggested both human and animal characteristics. Its face combined elements that shouldn't exist together. Intelligent eyes above a protruding muzzle filled with teeth designed for tearing meat. When it moved, the motion was fluid and predatory, covering ground with an efficiency that no human could match. "Run!" Marcus shouted to the students. "Get to the main trail and keep running." The creature let out that rumbling call again, but this time Marcus could see where it came from. The sound erupted from deep in its chest, a vocalization that seemed designed to disorient and terrify prey. As the call echoed off the canyon walls, two more creatures emerged from concealment. One from higher up the trail, one from behind a boulder formation to the left. Marcus was trapped between them, with three terrified college students depending on him for protection. He fired 3 quick shots at the nearest creature, aiming center mass. The reports echoed deafeningly in the narrow canyon, but all 3 bullets struck home. The creature staggered but didn't fall, dark liquid spraying from the wounds. Its reaction was more of annoyance than serious injury, as if Marcus had thrown rocks rather than fired a service weapon. "The main trail," Marcus yelled to the students. "Go now." Sarah, Tyler, and Jamie scrambled up the rocky slope toward the Bright Angel Trail junction, but the creatures moved to intercept them. These things had been hunting in the canyon for years. They knew the terrain, knew how to cut off escape routes, knew how to herd their prey into killing zones. Marcus emptied his magazine, trying to keep the creatures focused on him rather than the students. Several more bullets found their mark, but the things barely slowed down. Whatever they were, conventional firearms weren't going to stop them. He ejected the empty magazine and slammed in his spare, but one of the creatures was already too close. It covered the final 20 yards in a single bound, moving with an inhuman combination of power and agility. Marcus dove to the side, rolling behind a boulder as massive claws raked the air where he'd been standing. The creature landed and immediately spun toward him, its movement impossibly quick for something its size. Marcus fired 4 more rounds from his prone position, but the creature barely flinched. Dark blood ran from multiple wounds, but it showed no signs of being seriously injured. Up on the main trail, Marcus could hear the students screaming. They'd reached the junction, but so had the other creatures. The hunt was reaching its climax, and Marcus was pinned down with a rapidly dwindling ammunition supply. The creature stalking him paused, as if sensing his tactical disadvantage. Its eyes, disturbingly intelligent eyes, studied him with what almost looked like amusement. Then it opened its mouth and spoke. "Ranger," it said, its voice a grinding rasp that barely managed human speech. "You should not have come here." Marcus's mind reeled. In all the missing persons cases, in all the official reports and speculation, no one had ever suggested that whatever was taking people could speak. This changed everything. "Let them go," Marcus said, keeping his weapon trained on the creature's center mass. "Take me instead." The creature tilted its head, considering. "You misunderstand. We do not trade, we collect." Behind Marcus, the screaming on the main trail had stopped. He couldn't tell if that was good news or very bad news. The silence from the main trail was more terrifying than the screaming had been. Marcus strained to hear any sign that the students were still alive, but the canyon had returned to its oppressive quiet. Even the wind seemed to have died away, leaving only the sound of his own labored breathing and the creature's patient rumbling. "Your friends are unharmed," the creature said, as if reading his thoughts. "For now, they serve a purpose." "What purpose?" Marcus kept his weapon steady. Though he was down to his last few rounds, the creature gestured with one elongated arm toward the hidden settlement below. "They will join the others, as you will." "Others?" But even as Marcus asked, he understood. The missing persons cases going back decades, the cold case files that were never solved. Not all of the people who disappeared in the canyon had died. Some had been taken, kept alive for reasons Marcus was only beginning to comprehend. "You've been taking people for years," Marcus said. "The Park Service knows. They have records going back to the 70s. The creature's expression changed, showing what might have been amusement. "Your Park Service knows very little. They see the disappearances but not the pattern. They search for bodies but never find them. They close the cases and forget." "But why? What do you want with them?" "Survival," the creature said simply. "Adaptation. Your species has spread across our territory. We have learned to coexist." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the canyon air. "Coexist how?" Instead of answering, the creature let out a low call. Within moments, Marcus heard movement from the main trail above. Footsteps coming down the unmarked path. Human footsteps, but moving with an odd, shuffling gait. The first figure to emerge from the shadows made Marcus's stomach lurch. It was a man, probably in his 40s, wearing the tattered remains of hiking gear from at least a decade ago. But there was something fundamentally wrong with his movement, his posture, the way he held his head at an unnatural angle. Behind him came others, men and women of various ages, all wearing clothing from different eras. Some looked like they'd been there for years, others more recently arrived. They moved in single file down the trail, their movements synchronized in a way that human beings simply didn't walk. Marcus recognized the most recent addition to the group immediately. Tyler Brooks walked at the end of the line, his eyes vacant and his movement matching the other's unnatural gait. He showed no recognition when he looked at Marcus, no awareness of their earlier encounter. "My God," Marcus whispered. "What did you do to them?" "We improved them," the creature replied. "Your species is noisy, chaotic, prone to panic. We have taught them to be calm, useful." The line of altered humans continued past Marcus and the creature, heading down toward the hidden settlement. None of them spoke. None of them showed any emotion or individual thought. They'd been turned into something else, still technically human, but stripped of everything that made them people. "The girls," Marcus said. "Sarah and Jamie. Where are they?" "Being prepared. The process requires time." Marcus raised his weapon again, though he knew it would do little good. "I won't let you do this. You cannot stop us. Your kind never could." The creature took a step closer. "But you interest us, Ranger Rivera. 8 years you have worked here. 8 years you have walked our territory. You have seen things others missed." That was true. Marcus had always felt the canyon watching him, had always sensed something beyond normal wildlife in the remote areas. He'd attributed it to imagination, to the natural wariness that came with working alone in dangerous terrain. But he'd been sensing these creatures all along. "You have the awareness," the creature continued, "the sensitivity. You would adapt well to the improvements." "I'd rather die." "Death is wasteful. Your experience, your knowledge of this place. These things have value. You will see." The creature moved faster than Marcus could track, covering the distance between them in a single fluid motion. Pain exploded through his skull as something struck him from behind. Another creature had circled around during the conversation, Marcus felt his weapon slip from his hands as consciousness faded. His last clear thought was of the missing persons files back at the ranger station. Dozens of cases going back decades. All those people weren't dead. They were still here, still in the canyon, transformed into something that was no longer quite human. Marcus woke to the sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness. His head throbbed, and his mouth tasted of blood and dirt. When he tried to move, he discovered his hands were bound behind his back with what felt like rope made from plant fibers. He was in one of the caves, lying on a floor that felt like packed earth mixed with something organic. The air was thick with the smell he'd detected earlier, that mixture of decay and musk that seemed to permeate the entire settlement. Weak light filtered in from somewhere ahead, probably the cave entrance. As his eyes adjusted, Marcus could make out more details of his prison. The walls were covered with markings. Not random scratches, but deliberate carvings that formed patterns and symbols. Some looked recent, others seemed much older. They reminded him of petroglyphs he'd seen at other Southwest archaeological sites. But these symbols were unlike any documented Native American artwork. At the far end of the cave, barely visible in the dim light, he could see other prisoners. Human figures sitting against the walls, motionless but clearly alive. Their positioning was too regular, too organized to be natural. They were waiting for something. "You're awake." Marcus turned toward the voice. In the shadows to his left, he could make out a woman in torn hiking gear. Her voice was hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken in a long time. "How long have you been here?" Marcus asked. "I don't know, months maybe. Time doesn't work the same way down here." She shifted, and Marcus could see her face more clearly. She was young, probably in her 20s, with short blonde hair and the kind of tan that came from spending serious time outdoors. "I'm Marcus Rivera, park ranger." "I know. I heard them talking about you. They're excited." She paused. "I'm Kelly Morrison. I was doing a solo backpacking trip on the North Rim when they got me." Marcus tried to place the name. "When did you go missing?" "Last spring. April, I think. My family probably gave up searching by now." Marcus knew the case. Kelly Morrison, 24, had disappeared from the North Rim in April 2015. Her car had been found at the trailhead, but no trace of her had ever been discovered despite extensive search efforts. She'd been listed as a probable suicide or animal attack after the official search was suspended. "Kelly, listen to me. Are there others? How many people are being held here?" "Dozens. They keep us in different caves, move us around. Some have been here for years." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They're changing us, one by one. The process, it takes away who you are. You become like them." "What kind of process?" Before Kelly could answer, light appeared at the cave entrance. Two of the creatures entered, moving with that silent, predatory grace Marcus had witnessed on the trail. Behind them came several of the altered humans, including Tyler Brooks. Tyler's transformation was already visible. His posture had changed, becoming more rigid and controlled. His eyes, when they looked at Marcus, showed no recognition or emotion. Whatever made Tyler himself had been systematically removed. One of the creatures spoke, not the same one Marcus had encountered earlier, but its voice had the same grinding quality. "Time for selection." The altered humans moved through the cave, checking each prisoner. They passed over Kelly and several others, but stopped at an older man near the back wall. Without struggle or protest, he stood and walked with them toward the cave entrance. "Where are they taking him?" Marcus asked Kelly once the group had left. "To be improved," she said quietly. "They choose one every few days. When they come back," she gestured toward the motionless figures along the walls, "they're not themselves anymore." Marcus tested his bonds, but the rope was too tight and too well secured. "How long before they come for us?" "I don't know." "But Marcus," Kelly's voice was urgent, "when they do, don't fight it. Fighting makes it worse. They showed me what happens to the ones who resist." "What do you mean?" Kelly turned slightly, and in the dim light, Marcus could see the left side of her face. What he'd taken for shadows were actually deep scars, claw marks that ran from her temple to her jaw. "I fought them the first time," she said. "They didn't appreciate it." Marcus looked around the cave again, counting the prisoners he could see. 12 people, all in various stages of mental and physical deterioration. Some rocked back and forth continuously. Others stared at the walls with the blank expression he'd seen on Tyler's face. "Kelly, we have to get out of here. All of us. There's no way out. They're always watching. Always listening. And even if we could escape," she gestured toward the transformed humans, "where would we go? They know this place better than any human ever could." But Marcus was already working on a plan. 8 years as a park ranger had taught him about emergency protocols, about backup procedures that activated when rangers failed to check in. His radio silence would have been noticed by now. Henderson would have dispatched additional search teams, possibly even called in outside agencies. The question was whether help would arrive before Marcus joined the ranks of the altered prisoners walking these caves in silent servitude. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed through the canyon sometime after midnight, distant but unmistakable. Marcus had been listening for it, praying for it, since the afternoon sun had disappeared behind the canyon walls. Emergency protocol dictated that missing rangers triggered immediate response, but whether the search teams could find this hidden settlement was another question entirely. Kelly stirred beside him in the darkness. "What is that?" "Search and rescue," Marcus whispered. "They're looking for me. They won't find us down here. The creatures know how to hide." The helicopter sound grew closer, then faded as it moved on to search other sectors. But Marcus had heard something else beneath the rotor noise, voices calling his name, echoing off the canyon walls. The backup teams were following his trail down the main Bright Angel route. Light appeared at the cave entrance again. This time, 3 creatures entered along with a larger group of the altered humans. The procession moved with military precision, spreading throughout the cave to surround the prisoners. The lead creature approached Marcus directly. In the torchlight, he could see it more clearly than he had on the trail. The proportions were definitely humanoid, but scaled up and modified in ways that suggested either mutation or evolution. The musculature was adapted for power rather than endurance, perfect for short bursts of overwhelming violence. But the eyes showed unmistakable intelligence, not animal cunning but genuine reasoning ability. "Your colleagues search for you," the creature said. "They will not find this place, but their presence is inconvenient." "Let us go," Marcus said. "All of us. Take your people and disappear deeper into the canyon. No one has to get hurt." The creature made a sound that might have been laughter. "You misunderstand our situation, Ranger Rivera. We cannot simply disappear. This territory has been ours for generations. Your kind has encroached steadily into our domain. Adaptation was necessary. By kidnapping people? By turning them into slaves? By learning to coexist with an invasive species." The creature gestured toward the altered humans. "They are not slaves. They are improved, made efficient, given purpose." Marcus looked at Tyler Brooks, standing motionless among the group. The young man's face showed no emotion, no awareness of his surroundings beyond what was immediately necessary. Whatever process had been used on him had stripped away personality, free will, everything that made him human. "That's not improvement," Marcus said. "That's murder. It is survival, for both species." The creature leaned closer. "Your search teams will leave when they find no trace. They always do. The canyon will return to its natural state, and we will continue our work." But the creature was wrong. Even as it spoke, Marcus could hear the sounds of the search growing closer. Multiple voices now. Coordinated movement. The distinctive sound of tactical gear. This wasn't a standard Park Service search. Someone had called in federal resources. "The process will begin immediately," the creature announced. "Starting with you." 2 of the altered humans moved toward Marcus, but before they could reach him, new sounds echoed from the canyon above. Gunfire. Multiple weapons, sustained fire that suggested serious tactical engagement. The creatures reacted instantly, their heads turning toward the cave entrance with expressions of alarm. Whatever was happening above ground, it was beyond their experience or planning. "They found the trail," Marcus said. "My backup knew where I was going." More gunfire, closer now. And beneath it, a sound that made the creatures visibly agitated. Electronic static from radio communications. The search teams were using military-grade equipment that could punch through the canyon's interference. The lead creature turned back to Marcus, its expression shifting from confidence to something approaching desperation. "This cannot be allowed." It gestured to the other creatures who immediately began moving toward the cave entrance. But as they reached the opening, the first human voices became clearly audible from the settlement outside. "Federal agents! This area is under investigation. Multiple structures, possible hostile presence. Ranger Rivera. If you can hear this, identify your location." Marcus shouted back as loudly as he could. "Cave system, southeast corner, multiple prisoners." The response was immediate. Heavy footsteps moving rapidly across the settlement area, coordinated tactical deployment. These weren't park rangers or even local law enforcement. Someone had called in federal resources with serious firepower. The creatures fell back into the cave, their confident demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. They'd been the apex predators in this environment for decades, but they'd never faced a coordinated military response. "Kelly," Marcus whispered urgently, "when the shooting starts, get as far back in the cave as possible. Don't let yourself get caught in crossfire." The first federal agent appeared at the cave entrance, weapon drawn and flashlight cutting through the darkness. He was followed immediately by two others, all moving with the disciplined coordination of an experienced tactical team. "Federal agents, nobody move." The lead creature let out that rumbling call, but this time it sounded more like a warning than a hunting cry. The other creatures responded, emerging from concealment throughout the cave system, but they were no longer in their element. The confined space worked against their size and mobility advantages. The firefight was brief but intense. The Federal agents had modern weapons and tactical training, while the creatures relied on physical power that was less effective in close quarters. When it was over, two creatures lay dead, and the survivors had retreated deeper into the cave system. "Ranger Rivera?" The lead agent approached Marcus, keeping his weapon ready. "Here. There are multiple prisoners. Some require immediate medical attention. We've got medical teams en route." The agent cut Marcus's bonds with a tactical knife. "Agent Patterson, FBI. We've been tracking unusual disappearances in this area for months." "Months?" Marcus rubbed, feeling back into his hands. "Why wasn't the Park Service notified?" "Because officially this place doesn't exist." Patterson helped Marcus to his feet. "No geological surveys show this canyon formation. No satellite imagery captures it clearly. Someone went to a lot of trouble to keep it hidden." As Federal agents secured the cave and began evacuating prisoners, Marcus learned the scope of what they'd discovered. The hidden settlement contained evidence of dozens of disappearances going back decades. The caves held preserved personal effects from missing persons cases across multiple states, all carefully cataloged and stored. But the most disturbing discovery came when the agents began interviewing the altered humans. Under medical examination, it became clear that whatever process had been used on them was reversible, but only partially. The victims retained their memories and basic cognitive function, but their personalities and emotional responses had been fundamentally changed. Tyler Brooks, when questioned, could remember his life before capture but felt no emotional connection to it. He described his friends and family as if discussing strangers. The process hadn't erased his humanity so much as severed his connection to it. "Can they recover?" Marcus asked the FBI medical examiner. "Unknown. We've never seen anything like this. It's not chemical or surgical. There's no evidence of brain damage or foreign substances. It's as if something rewrote their basic psychological architecture." The surviving creatures had vanished deeper into the canyon, but extensive cave mapping revealed a network of tunnels and chambers that extended for miles underground. The settlement Marcus had discovered was only the surface level of a much larger complex. "We'll be investigating this for years," Patterson told Marcus as they climbed back toward the main trail. "These things, whatever they are, they've been here for generations, learning, adapting, developing techniques for managing human populations." "Managing? Look at the pattern. They never took enough people to trigger major investigations, never left enough evidence to prove what was happening. They've been farming us, Ranger Rivera, taking just enough to meet their needs while staying below the threshold of official response." As they reached the main Bright Angel Trail, Marcus looked back down into the hidden canyon. Somewhere in those depths, creatures that shouldn't exist continued to lurk, possibly planning their next adaptation to human encroachment. The missing person statistics would need to be completely reevaluated. How many of the people listed as victims of hiking accidents or animal attacks had actually been taken to places like this? "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now we figure out how many other hidden settlements exist," Patterson said. "And we learn how to fight something that's been studying us for longer than we've been studying it." The helicopter extraction lifted Marcus out of the canyon as dawn broke over the rim. But even as he rose towards safety, he could feel eyes watching from the shadows below. The creatures were still there, still adapting, still learning. The war for the canyon was far from over. 6 months later, Marcus Rivera submitted his final report to a joint FBI National Park Service task force. The hidden canyon had been sealed and placed under federal protection, but similar sites had been discovered in remote areas across the Southwest. The altered humans were slowly recovering in a classified medical facility, but their experiences had provided disturbing insights into the creatures' capabilities. They weren't just predators, they were researchers, studying human behavior and psychology with the patience of a species that measured time in centuries rather than years. Tyler Brooks had recovered enough to return to college, but he remained emotionally distant from his previous life. Sarah Chen and Jamie Valdez were making better progress, though they reported recurring dreams of the settlement and the feeling that they were still being watched. Marcus requested transfer to the task force full-time. Someone needed to understand these things, to learn their patterns, to prepare for the inevitable next encounter. Because one thing had become clear during the investigation: the hidden canyon wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pilot program, and somewhere in the vast wilderness of America's national parks, the real work was just beginning. The mountains have secrets they don't share with outsiders. I've known this since I was old enough to walk the trails with my grandfather. My name's Marcus Dakota, and this happened to me in 2003 up in a part of the Great Smoky Mountains you won't find marked on tourist maps. I was born and raised in Cherokee, North Carolina, and I've worked for years maintaining old logging trails, setting camera traps, guiding a few hunters who don't mind steep grades and deep woods. My grandfather used to call that part of the range the Bone Hollow. Not a real name, just a warning. That spring, I was helping survey old boundary lines around the southwest side of the park near Thunderhead Mountain, between Cades Cove and the Tennessee line. Off-trail work, rough country, the kind where compass and topographic maps are your only friends and losing daylight means real trouble. A guy from the state, Dylan Porter, had gotten turned around 2 weeks prior. They found his pack hanging 15 feet up a tree, not torn, not chewed, just hung there like someone wanted it seen. No blood, no body. They called it a bear, but even green hikers can tell what a bear kill looks like. I've gutted enough hogs to know what a bear's claws will do. What they won't do is arrange a pack in a tree like a decoration. I took that job for 2 reasons. 1, it paid good. 2, I had to know what happened to Dylan. The morning I left, the ranger station was buzzing with theories. Probably fell into a ravine, said Jim Blackwell, head ranger. Search and rescue missed him in the undergrowth. Bears don't hang backpacks, I countered, checking my supplies one final time. Jim's eyes narrowed. Nobody said they did. Then who did? He just shrugged, but there was something in his expression, like he knew more than he was saying. Follow the boundary markers, he instructed, handing me a weathered map with red X's marking where the old survey posts should be. Document any that are missing or damaged. And Marcus, he paused, don't go looking for trouble. I'm just doing the job, I replied, shouldering my pack. Make sure that's all you do. His tone made me pause. We've had reports of poachers in that area. Could be dangerous, but I'd grown up tracking every kind of animal these mountains produced. I knew what signs poachers left. Shell casings, gut piles, ATV tracks. What happened to Dylan didn't match any of that. The drive to the trailhead took almost 2 hours. The last 5 miles were on a dirt road so seldom used that saplings had started growing in the center. I parked at the old fire road gate, double-checked my GPS, and headed in. The forest welcomed me with its familiar scent of pine sap and damp earth. Spring was pushing through, but at this elevation, winter still clung to the shadows. The trail disappeared after the first mile, forcing me to navigate by compass and intuition. By midday, I'd reached the first boundary marker, a concrete post dating back to the 1930s when the park was established. I documented it, replaced the faded marker, and pressed on. The terrain grew steeper as I climbed. Roots and rocks created natural staircases that tested my endurance. The forest changed character too, transitioning from mixed hardwoods to dense stands of red spruce and Fraser fir. The canopy thickened, filtering the sunlight into ghostly beams that barely reached the forest floor. I was making good time until I found the first anomaly, a tree scarred with 3 parallel gouges about 7 feet up the trunk. Not bear claws, the spacing was wrong, too methodical. I photographed it and marked its location. A quarter-mile later, I found another marked tree. Then another. They formed a line heading deeper into territory even locals avoided. A stretch of land my grandfather's generation called Shadow Valley, but the older Cherokee named something that roughly translated to where the quiet waits. I should have reported the markings and continued with my assigned route. But the direction of those marks aligned with where they'd found Dylan's pack. The smart choice would have been to stick to the boundary survey. Instead, I diverted course, following the marked trees. The undergrowth thickened as I descended into a narrow valley where the sunlight barely penetrated. The temperature dropped noticeably. I found the first piece of evidence near a stream crossing. A single hiking boot, Dylan's size and brand, sitting upright on a flat rock as if placed there deliberately. No blood, no signs of struggle. Just a lone boot positioned like a signpost. My radio crackled with static when I tried to report in. No signal. I was too deep in the valley, surrounded by steep ridges that blocked transmission. I'd have to climb higher to make contact. I photographed the boot, marked its GPS coordinates, and continued following the tree marks. They led to a game trail I'd never seen before. Despite having hunted these mountains for decades, the trail wasn't made by deer or elk. The spacing was wrong, too wide for a 4-legged animal. Whatever made this path walked on 2 legs, with a stride longer than mine. As daylight began to fade, I found a defensible campsite on a small rise overlooking the valley. I set up my tent with its back to a rock face, giving me clear sight lines in all other directions. Years in these mountains had taught me to respect what I couldn't explain, and today had shown me plenty I couldn't explain. While gathering firewood, I found scratches on the rocks surrounding my camp. Not random, but deliberate. Symbols. Some resembled Cherokee syllabary, but distorted as if someone had seen them once and tried to recreate them from memory. I built my fire larger than usual that night. Not for warmth, but for light. And as darkness settled over the mountains, I loaded my shotgun and kept it across my lap. The forest grew unnaturally silent as night deepened. No owls called. No insects chirped. Even the wind seemed to hold its voice. Something was out there, watching. I could feel it. Day one was quiet, cold for April, with steel pockets of snow lingering in the shadows. I set camp by a narrow stream maybe 5 miles off any marked trail. No sound but wind and chickadees. The place became too quiet after sundown. Like every living creature had collectively decided to hold still. I strung up my food, banked the fire low, and tried to sleep. Something moved through camp around 2 a.m. Big, slow steps, then nothing, just gone. I didn't move, just listened. I figured a bear might sniff around, maybe a stray coyote, but nothing scratched. Nothing nudged the tent. Next morning, my boot tracks were still there, alongside another set. Wider. 3 toes. Deep prints like it carried weight unevenly. No claws. Just pressure marks that dug straight in. That wasn't elk, bear, or anything I had ever seen. The prints came right to my tent, paused, and walked back into the woods. I crouched beside one of the clearer impressions, placing my hand beside it for scale. The track measured nearly 16 inches long, twice the size of my boot. The 3 toes splayed outward, with what looked like a smaller 4th digit set farther back, almost like a rudimentary heel. My first thought was bear, walking on injured paws, but bears leave claw marks and the weight distribution would be different. This was something bipedal, something that walked upright with a rolling gait, based on the depth variation across the print. I followed the tracks to the edge of camp where they disappeared into a thicket of mountain laurel. The brush showed no signs of disturbance beyond that point, as if whatever made those prints had simply vanished or knew exactly how to move without leaving signs. The rational part of my brain tried to find explanations. A hunter with modified boots? Some elaborate prank? But deep in these mountains, miles from the nearest trail, who would bother? And why come so close to my tent without making their presence known? I documented the tracks with my camera, then packed up camp. The boundary survey would have to wait. I needed to understand what was happening in these woods. The day turned warmer as I pushed deeper into the valley, following the direction the tracks had taken. The terrain grew increasingly difficult. Dense thickets of rhododendron formed nearly impenetrable walls, forcing me to detour around or crawl through on hands and knees. Around midday, I found more tracks crossing a muddy seep, fresher this time with water still slowly filling the depressions. Whatever made them was moving parallel to me, perhaps 100 yards to my east, heading toward the same destination. I altered my course to intercept, moving as quietly as years of hunting had taught me. The forest changed character as I descended further. The trees grew more twisted, their branches reaching out at unnatural angles. Moss hung in thick curtains, muffling sound and limiting visibility. In a small clearing, I found disturbed ground where something had been digging. The hole was about 2 feet deep and perfectly circular, like it had been cut with a tool rather than excavated by claws. At the bottom lay a collection of small animal bones, rodents mostly, arranged in a pattern resembling a spiral. This wasn't the work of any animal I knew. Animals kill for food or territory. They don't arrange bones in geometric patterns. I photographed the site and continued forward, more cautiously now. The sense of being watched intensified. Twice I spun around, certain I'd catch something ducking behind a tree, but saw nothing. Late in the afternoon, I came across a stream I recognized from hunting trips years before. I was now in what locals called Blackjack Ridge, though it wasn't marked as such on any official map. If I followed the stream east, I'd eventually hit a fire road that would lead back to civilization. But west, upstream, lay the deepest part of Bone Hollow, the area my grandfather had specifically warned me about. The land changes there, he'd told me once, and so does what lives on it. As a child, I dismissed his warnings as superstition. As an adult who'd spent decades in these mountains, I'd come to understand that my grandfather's generation knew things about these woods that no scientific survey had ever documented. I made camp early that evening, selecting a spot on a rocky outcrop overlooking the stream. The elevation gave me visibility in all directions and made approach difficult. I gathered extra firewood, building a larger fire than was strictly necessary, and positioned my tent so that its entrance faced the flames. As darkness fell, fog rose from the valley floor, curling around the trees like spectral fingers. Through gaps in the mist, I could see the moon rising, full and bright enough to cast shadows. I ate a cold dinner, not wanting to waste time cooking. Every sound from the forest below made me tense. A branch breaking, a stone dislodged from the stream bed. Small sounds that would normally be insignificant seemed amplified by the unnatural stillness between them. Around midnight, the temperature dropped dramatically. I zipped my sleeping bag up to my chin and kept my shotgun within reach. Sleep came in fitful bursts, broken by the slightest sounds. At 2:17 a.m., according to my watch, I woke to absolute silence. Even the stream seemed to have stopped its eternal murmur. In that silence, I heard breathing. Slow, measured, and much too close. I lay perfectly still, eyes open in the darkness of my tent. The breathing moved around the perimeter of my camp, pausing occasionally before continuing its circuit. It wasn't the snuffling of a bear or the panting of a coyote. It was controlled, deliberate, something pressed against the side of my tent. Not hard, just enough to create a slight bulge in the fabric. I reached slowly for my shotgun, finger resting alongside the trigger guard. The pressure disappeared. Heavy footsteps circled to the front of the tent, where the fire still burned low. Through the thin nylon, I could see a massive silhouette cast against the firelight. Bipedal, with disproportionately long arms and a hunched posture. It stood there for what felt like hours, but must have been only minutes, watching me through the tent as I watched its shadow. Then, with a swiftness that defied its size, it was gone. I didn't sleep again that night. When dawn finally broke, I emerged cautiously from my tent, shotgun ready. The fire had burned to ash, and a new set of those strange three-toed tracks circled my camp. They led to the edge of the outcrop, then simply ended, as if whatever made them had leapt off the 15-foot drop. I checked the ground below, but found no landing marks, no disturbed vegetation, nothing to indicate where it had gone. One other detail caught my eye. My backpack, which I'd left leaning against a tree, had been opened. Nothing was missing, but everything had been carefully removed, examined, and replaced. Even the energy bars had been unwrapped, inspected, and rewrapped in their original packaging. Whatever had visited me in the night wasn't just an animal. It was curious, methodical, intelligent, and it was studying me. I pushed deeper that day. Dense laurels, deadfalls, broken terrain made GPS all but useless. The forest grew thicker, wilder, untouched by trail maintenance or human passage. I found myself checking over my shoulder with increasing frequency, unable to shake the feeling of being followed. Around noon, I found a nest. That's what I'd call it anyway. A tangle of pine boughs, deer bones, bits of bark and mud packed into the side of a slope. It smelled like wet dog and rot. At the center lay a pile of clothes, torn jacket, hiking boots. The boots matched the report. Dylan's size, same make. The laces were cut clean, not torn, cut, something with fingers. I approached cautiously, camera ready to document what I found. The nest was elaborate, larger than it first appeared, with tunnel-like entrances woven into the surrounding vegetation. The construction showed purposeful design. Lower areas packed with soft materials like moss and shredded bark. Higher sections reinforced with interwoven branches capable of supporting significant weight. What disturbed me most was the collection of items carefully arranged at the center. Dylan's boots, his torn jacket, a compass with its needle removed, the metal backing of his watch with the mechanisms extracted. Nearby lay a neat pile of energy bar wrappers, the same brand I carried, smoothed flat and stacked by color. I'd seen similar behavior in ravens, collecting shiny objects, arranging them by type. But this was different, more deliberate, more analytical. I backed out and radioed the ranger station. Static. No reply, not even a squelch. I hiked east toward a ridge where I knew signal was better. That's when I saw the camera, game cam, hung high in a red maple. New, not mine, not park issue either. Military grade, camouflage shell, infrared lens. Hadn't been there last season. The camera was pointed not at a trail, but into open woods, toward nothing, like someone knew exactly where something would be. I climbed up to examine it closer. No manufacturer's mark, no serial number, just a small insignia I didn't recognize, a triangle inside a circle, with 3 dots arranged in a pattern that matched the 3-toed prints I'd been following. The memory card slot was empty. Someone had collected its data recently. I scanned the surrounding trees and found 2 more cameras positioned to create overlapping fields of view centered on the area where I'd found the nest. This wasn't the work of hunters or park rangers. This was a monitoring system. But who was monitoring what? And why here, in one of the most remote sections of the park? I continued toward the ridge, hoping for radio contact. The terrain steepened dramatically, forcing me to use tree roots as handholds on the near vertical climb. When I finally reached the top, the view took my breath away, not for its beauty, but for what it revealed. From this elevation, I could see patterns in the forest canopy that weren't visible from below. Circular clearings, dozens of them, arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate geometric pattern across the valley. The clearings weren't natural. The trees at their edges were broken at consistent heights, as if something had created spaces precisely sized for some unknown purpose. I tried the radio again. This time, I got a response, though heavily distorted by static. Copy? Marcus? Location? The voice belonged to Jim Blackwell. I'm at the northeast ridge overlooking Shadow Valley, I reported. Jim, something's going on out here. I found what looks like a nest with Dylan's belongings, and cameras, military grade. Someone's monitoring this area. The static increased, but I caught fragments of his response. Get out. Immediately. Not alone out there. Jim, I found tracks, not animal tracks. Something bipedal, 3-toed. And the nest, it's like nothing I've ever seen. Organized, methodical. His next words came through clearly, as if whatever had been interfering with the signal had momentarily lifted. Marcus, listen carefully. There's a research team operating in that sector, classified. They're tracking something. Get out of there now. Head east to Fire Road 23. I'll have someone meet you. What are they tracking, Jim? The radio went silent for several seconds. Then, something we don't understand yet. Please, Marcus. East to Fire Road 23. Now. The transmission ended with a burst of static. I tried to re-establish contact but got nothing. Research team. Classified. The pieces started falling into place, the cameras, the geometric patterns in the forest. Someone knew what was out here and was studying it, not hunting it. I checked my compass and map. Fire Road 23 was about 4 miles east. If I pushed hard, I could make it before dark. I started to descend from the ridge when movement in the valley below caught my eye. A figure moved through the trees with unnatural speed. Too fast for a human on that terrain, but moving with purpose. Weaving between obstacles without slowing. It was headed directly for where I'd found the nest. I raised my binoculars, trying to get a better look, but the canopy obscured most details. All I could make out was a tall, lean form that seemed to flow over the landscape rather than travel across it. Within seconds, it disappeared into the undergrowth. My instincts screamed to follow Jim's advice. Head east, get out, let whatever specialized team was operating here deal with this. But Dylan Porter was still missing, and I now had evidence he'd encountered whatever was being studied. I made my decision. I'd head toward Fire Road 23 as instructed, but take a route that would let me observe more of those circular clearings. If I was going to report what I'd found, I wanted as much information as possible. The descent was treacherous, loose shale giving way under my boots and forcing me to catch myself on saplings. By the time I reached level ground, the light was starting to fade. I'd have to hurry to have any chance of reaching the fire road before complete darkness. I moved as quickly as the terrain allowed, keeping the ridge to my left as a navigational reference. About a mile in, I came across one of the circular clearings I'd spotted from above. Up close, it was even more unnerving. The ground was completely bare. No undergrowth, no fallen leaves, nothing but exposed soil that appeared to have been treated with something that prevented regrowth. The trees surrounding the clearing were uniformly broken at exactly 12 feet high, their splintered trunks cauterized as if by intense heat. At the center of the clearing stood a single metal rod, about 3 feet tall, topped with what looked like a small satellite dish aimed skyward. A thin cable ran from its base to a metallic box half buried at the edge of the clearing. This was no natural phenomenon. This was technology, advanced technology, deliberately placed here in one of the most remote parts of the Smokies. I photographed everything, then continued east, pushing through increasingly dense undergrowth as twilight deepened around me. I'd need to find a defensive position soon. Traveling these woods after dark with something like I'd seen tracking me would be suicide. That's when I heard it, a low, rhythmic humming coming from somewhere ahead. Not mechanical, not animal. something between the two pulsing at regular intervals that seemed to vibrate in my chest cavity. Against better judgment, I moved toward the sound. That night, I didn't light a fire. I strung my hammock high off the ground near the cliff's edge where nothing could approach unseen. I stayed up watching. At 3:17 a.m., I saw it. First came the sound like branches breaking, but no wind, a slow, heavy movement through the laurel brush below. I clicked my headlamp on low and held it steady. Then it stepped into the moonlight, maybe 7 feet tall. Crooked legs, thin arms with too many connecting points. Skin like wet shale, gray, blotched, almost reflective. No fur. Its head seemed disproportionate to its body, flat along the top with an unusual structure. 2 forward-facing eyes. Jet black, not animal eyes, the kind that look at you like they're reading a manual. 1 nostril slit, no mouth I could see until it opened sideways, stretching ear to ear like a cut in leather. It didn't charge, didn't growl. It just stood there, watching me. I stayed still, breathing slow. Something about it said not to run. It turned its head, bird-like, slow and tilting, then vanished in one motion, like it fell into the dark and didn't hit ground. The encounter lasted perhaps 20 seconds, but in that time my understanding of the natural world fundamentally shifted. This wasn't a known species, not a bear walking upright, not a person in some elaborate costume. This was something else entirely. Its movements defied normal biomechanics, fluid yet angular, each motion precise and deliberate. The way it observed me suggested not just intelligence but analysis. It wasn't seeing me as prey or predator, but as a subject of study. When daylight came, I examined the area where it had stood. The ground showed those same 3-toed prints I'd been following, but with additional detail visible in the soft earth. Texture patterns on the soles that resembled microscopic circuitry too fine and regular to be natural. By morning I was packed and moving. No trail, just bearing east. My goal was a service road near Lead Cove. I made 6 miles before I hit the ash line. Everything in a 50-foot radius had been scorched. Not burned, just dead. Bark split open, leaves crisp and black. No flame signs, no soot. The smell was chemical, faintly metallic. In the center, a mound of soil with a circular indentation like something had pressed down hard and lifted off. The vegetation hadn't just died, it had been desiccated, all moisture extracted in an instant. Trees that should have taken hours to burn through were hollow shells, their interiors reduced to fine ash that crumbled at the slightest touch. I photographed it, left a GPS marker, and kept moving. But the ash line was just the beginning. As I continued east, I encountered more clearings, each larger than the last, each bearing that same chemical smell and circular impression. Around midday, I found tracks again, but different from before. These showed 5 digits instead of 3, arranged in a pattern that approximated a human footprint but with proportions that were slightly wrong. The toes too long, the arch too pronounced. They led to a small stream where I found something that stopped me cold. A research station. Canvas tent, solar panels, satellite uplink, all military grade, all bearing that same triangular insignia I'd seen on the cameras. The station appeared recently abandoned. A laptop sat open on a folding table, its screen dark but power light still blinking. Nearby, a collection of sample containers held soil, water, and what looked like tissue specimens floating in clear fluid. On the tent wall hung a map marked with dozens of red dots, each corresponding to one of the circular clearings I'd observed. Handwritten notes filled the margins, most in scientific shorthand I couldn't decipher, but one phrase stood out clearly. Adaptive morphology confirmed. Subject demonstrates unprecedented environmental response rate. I tried to access the laptop, but it required credentials I didn't have. Instead, I photographed everything. The map, the sample containers, the equipment labels. As I was documenting the site, my radio crackled to life. Immediate evacuation. All personnel. Containment protocol initiated. The voice wasn't Jim's. It was clipped, official, using terminology that sounded military rather than Park Service. I grabbed the radio. This is Marcus Dakota. I'm near your research station in Sector 7. I need extraction and information about what I'm dealing with out here. Silence, then. Identify security clearance and project designation. I don't have clearance. I'm a local guide conducting a boundary survey for the Park Service. I've encountered your subject. Another pause. Longer this time. Then a different voice, authoritative. Mr. Dakota, this is Colonel Harmon, Joint Special Operations Command. Your location has been triangulated. Remain where you are. An extraction team is en route. Approximate arrival time 1800 hours. Colonel, I found evidence of a missing hiker at one of the nests. Dylan Porter. Your subject took him, didn't it? That information is classified. Do not attempt further contact with the subject. It has demonstrated unpredictable behavioral patterns when the transmission cut off abruptly. At the same moment, a high-pitched tone emanated from the equipment around me. The laptop screen flashed to life, displaying a single pulsing dot moving rapidly toward the research station. Toward me. I didn't wait to see what would arrive. I grabbed my pack and ran, heading east as fast as the terrain would allow. Behind me, something crashed through the underbrush, heavy, fast, and closing the distance. I reached a ravine and descended recklessly, half sliding down the steep incline. At the bottom, a fallen tree created a natural bridge across a swollen creek. I crossed it and continued uphill on the other side, my lungs burning with exertion. The crashing sound stopped. I paused behind a massive oak, trying to control my breathing as I scanned the ravine behind me. Nothing moved. No sound except the rushing creek and distant birdsong. Then a shadow fell across me from above. I looked up to see it perched on a branch 30 feet over my head. The same creature from the night before, but in daylight. Its features were even more unsettling. Its skin had changed color, now matching the dappled browns and greens of the forest canopy. It clung to the branch with those three-toed feet, its body angled in a way that should have been physically impossible. It watched me with those black, analytical eyes. Then, deliberately, it raised a hand and pointed east, the direction I'd been heading, the direction of Fire Road 23 and potential safety. It was guiding me out, or hurting me. I had no choice but to continue east, maintaining visual contact with the creature as it moved parallel to me through the canopy, sometimes disappearing only to reappear ahead. As if anticipating my route, after an hour of this bizarre escort, I reached a ridge overlooking what had to be Fire Road 23. In the distance, I could see vehicles approaching, black SUVs with government plates. When I turned to look for the creature, it was gone. In its place, hanging from a branch, was Dylan Porter's watch. Intact now, functioning, its second hand ticking steadily. A message. But what it meant, I couldn't begin to guess. That evening, I reached a cabin used by trail crews in summer. I broke in, standard forest key, and set up for the night. Windows barred, thick walls. I slept light. It came again, scraped the roof once, long dragging sound like claws or metal. Then silence. I waited, heart pounding, sweat running down my back despite the cold. Then something hit the door hard. Not like it wanted in, like it was testing it. 3 knocks, then a pause, then a single knock, softer. It did that for half an hour. I sat with the shotgun across my lap, not moving. It never spoke, never growled, just knocked, like it was mimicking something it had seen before. At dawn, it was gone. Tracks led back toward Bone Hollow. The knocking pattern stayed with me. 3 knocks, pause, 1 knock. It wasn't random, it was communication, or an attempt at it. I made it to the ranger station by noon. The place was in chaos. Park vehicles coming and going, unfamiliar government SUVs parked haphazardly, men in tactical gear unloading equipment. Jim Blackwell spotted me and hurried over, relief evident on his face. "Thank God," he said, grabbing my arm and steering me away from the activity. "I thought we'd lost you too. What's happening, Jim? What is that thing out there? And who are these people?" He pulled me into his office and closed the door. "They're with a joint task force, military, CDC, Department of Energy. They've had a research operation in the park for months, very hush-hush. All I know is they're tracking something they call a non-conventional biological entity. It's not an animal, Jim. I saw it. Watched it. It's intelligent, studying us." Jim's expression darkened. "They know. That's what scares them. It learns, adapts. They think it might be changing to mimic what it observes." "Dylan Porter?" Jim shook his head. "I don't know. They took over the search operation completely after you reported finding his boots. The official story is still that he's missing, presumed dead from exposure or wildlife." A knock at the door interrupted us. A man in a dark suit entered without waiting for a response. "Mr. Takota? I'm Dr. Emerson with the Advanced Biological Research Division. We need to debrief you immediately." Jim stood. "He just got back from 5 days in the field. He needs rest." "This can't wait." Emerson's tone left no room for argument. "National security implications." I was escorted to a mobile command center set up in the park's maintenance yard. Inside, monitors displayed topographic maps of Bone Hollow overlaid with data points and movement patterns. A team of analysts worked at computer stations, while military personnel maintained perimeter security. Dr. Emerson led me to a conference room where 3 other researchers waited. They recorded my account of everything I'd seen, stopping me frequently to clarify details about the creature's appearance, movement, and behavior. They seemed particularly interested in its skin's ability to change color and the knocking pattern it had used at the cabin. It's communication, confirmed a linguist named Dr. Chen. We've recorded 17 distinct patterns. The 3-1 sequence you experienced appears to be an interrogative, a question. What was it asking? I demanded. The researchers exchanged glances. Finally, Emerson spoke. We believe it was asking if you were the same as the others it had encountered, our research team. And what exactly is it? I pressed. Emerson hesitated then. We don't know its origin. It first appeared 6 months ago after unusual seismic activity in the area. At first we thought it was some unknown species that had been living deep underground, forced to the surface by the tremors. But its biology, it's unlike anything we've ever documented. It adapts, added another researcher, rapidly. Its cellular structure can reorganize in response to environmental stimuli. We've observed it change not just coloration but physical characteristics based on what it encounters. Including humans? I asked, thinking of those 5-toed tracks I'd found. Emerson nodded grimly. We believe it's studying us, learning, possibly preparing to evolve. After the debriefing, I was asked to sign multiple non-disclosure agreements. They offered me a substantial consultation fee in exchange for my silence and future assistance as a local expert. I told them what they wanted to hear, signed their papers, took their money. But I started digging on my own. I found the same camera brand listed in a procurement document from a federal wildlife agency tied to Fort Detrick, meant for behavioral study of non-native fauna and containment zones. Except there are no containment zones in the Smokies, right? Wrong. Through contacts in the Cherokee community and months of research, I pieced together a disturbing pattern. The area my grandfather called Bone Hollow had a history of unexplained phenomena dating back centuries. Tribal elders spoke of a time when the hollow ground spoke and something answered from above. I spoke to an old woman in Cherokee. She said there were stories of watchers in the woods, not spirits, not ghosts, flesh. Something old that mimics movement and sound, follows from just out of sight, waits for patterns. She called it Tai Elegua, not a word you'll find in a textbook, means it waits among us. She said it doesn't eat the way we think, doesn't kill to survive. It studies, adapts, remembers. Government geological surveys from the 1950s marked that entire region for restricted research access, following unexplained radiation readings. In 1978, a classified project codenamed Deep Mirror established permanent monitoring stations throughout the area. I think it took Dylan because it wanted to learn. Left the pack as a message. I think it knocked on the cabin to see what I'd do. And I think it burned those patches of forest clean because it didn't want anyone else finding its nests. 3 months after my encounter, I received an unmarked package containing Dylan Porter's journal. The final entry, dated the day before his disappearance, described finding a structure like nothing I've ever seen, geometric but organic, growing from the forest floor as if the earth itself was trying to reach skyward. The journal came with a flash drive containing a single video file, footage from one of those military-grade cameras. It showed Dylan approaching what looked like a translucent membrane stretched between trees. As he reached out to touch it, the membrane rippled, then opened like a mouth. The video ended there. No note, no explanation of how the package found me, but the triangular insignia was stamped on the inner flap. A warning? A request for help? Or something else entirely? I've been back to the Smokies dozens of times since then, mapping those circular clearings, documenting changes. They're expanding, forming larger patterns visible only from satellite imagery, patterns that match ancient Cherokee petroglyphs depicting what they called the Star Visitor's footprint. The government research teams are still there, their presence disguised as ecological studies or wildlife management. But their equipment grows more sophisticated, their perimeters more secure. Whatever they're studying, whatever found its way to Bone Hollow, it's still there, still watching, still learning. So if you're out there, anywhere in those woods south of Cades Cove, and you hear a knock at night that doesn't make sense, don't answer, don't run, and don't think it's alone, because something out there is still watching, still testing, and I don't think it's finished with us yet. Sometimes, late at night, I hear it. 3 knocks. Pause. 1 knock. Against my bedroom window. Testing. Asking. Waiting for an answer I'm not ready to give, because I understand now what my grandfather meant when he named that place Bone Hollow. It wasn't just a warning, it was a prophecy. My name is Marcus Rivera. And I spent 8 years as a park ranger in some of America's most remote wilderness areas. What I'm about to tell you is the reason I quit, moved to the city, and now work a desk job where the most dangerous thing I encounter is a paper cut. People keep asking me why I left such a dream job. They think I'm crazy for trading the mountains for concrete and fluorescent lights. They're wrong. I'm the sanest person alive. It started 3 years ago when I transferred to Black Pine National Forest in northern Montana. The posting was considered a punishment assignment. 40,000 acres of dense wilderness that stretched along the Canadian border, managed by just 3 rangers. The previous ranger, Tom Hendricks, had requested an emergency transfer after only 6 months. His replacement lasted 3 weeks before disappearing entirely. They found his truck at the trailhead, keys still in the ignition, but no trace of him anywhere. I should have seen the red flags. But I was young, ambitious, and desperate to prove myself after a disciplinary action at my previous posting. Black Pine seemed like a chance to rebuild my career in solitude. The Forest Service headquarters sat in a small clearing, a modest log cabin with solar panels and a radio tower. My supervisor, Chief Ranger Helen Kozlowski, was a weathered woman in her 50s who'd spent her entire career in the wilderness. During my orientation, she laid out my duties with military precision: maintain trails, monitor wildlife, assist hikers, and file daily reports. "One more thing," she said, sliding a laminated sheet across her desk. "These are our protocols for unusual incidents." I scanned the list, expecting standard safety procedures. Instead, I found bizarre instructions. If you hear voices calling your name from the woods, do not respond or investigate. Never follow trails that appear overnight. If you encounter structures that don't belong, retreat immediately and radio for backup. Report all instances of displaced wildlife or animal remains. If you see people in the forest after sunset, maintain distance and observe only. "Ma'am, some of these seem strange." Helen's gray eyes were stone cold. "Son, you'll learn that strange is relative out here. Follow those protocols exactly, and you might last longer than your predecessors." She walked me to the parking area where my patrol vehicle waited. A modified pickup truck equipped with emergency supplies, a high-powered radio, and something I'd never seen in government vehicles before: a shotgun mounted in plain view behind the driver's seat. "Why the shotgun?" I asked. Helen's expression grew distant. "Bears," she said after a pause. "Very aggressive bears." That night, I settled into the small ranger cabin that would be my home. It was spartanly furnished but comfortable, with a wood-burning stove and enough supplies to last weeks without resupply. As darkness fell, I noticed something odd about the windows. They were equipped with heavy-duty locks more suited to a bunker than a cabin. Even stranger, the locks were on the inside. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by sound outside. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and peered through the window, but saw only trees swaying in the wind. The footsteps continued for nearly an hour before fading away. I told myself it was an animal. Deer, maybe, or an elk looking for food. But animals don't walk in perfect circles, and they don't pause directly outside your bedroom window like they're listening. The next morning, I found tracks in the soft earth around the cabin. They were human footprints, but wrong somehow. Too long, with claw marks where toes should be. I took photos and measurements before the wind erased them, but when I tried to upload them to my computer, the files were corrupted. 3 weeks into my assignment, I received my first emergency call. A family camping near Echo Lake reported their teenage son missing. Jason Winters, 17, had left their campsite after dinner to explore and never returned. Search and rescue protocols kicked in immediately. I had a 4-hour window to locate him before additional resources would be deployed. Echo Lake sat 6 miles deep into the forest, accessible only by foot. The trail wound through dense pine stands that filtered sunlight into green-tinted twilight even at midday. As I hiked, my radio crackled with static, finally losing signal entirely 3 miles in. The Winters family campsite was organized and well-equipped. Robert and Linda Winters struck me as experienced outdoors people, not the type to panic easily. Their daughter, 15-year-old Emma, sat wrapped in a blanket despite the warm afternoon. "Jason knows these woods," Robert insisted. "He's been hiking since he was 8. He wouldn't just get lost." Linda's hands shook as she poured coffee from a thermos. "He was acting strange last night. Kept looking at the tree line like something was watching us. Said he heard voices calling to him." My blood went cold. The first protocol rule. Voices from the woods. "What kind of voices?" I asked carefully. "Children," Emma whispered. "Children laughing and calling his name. But there weren't any other kids here." I spent 2 hours searching in expanding circles around their campsite, calling Jason's name and following every trail. The forest felt wrong somehow. Too quiet, as if even the birds were afraid to make noise. Several times I caught movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned, nothing was there. 4 miles from the campsite, I found something that made my skin crawl. A trail I'd never seen before, despite knowing every path in this section of forest. The ground was packed earth worn smooth by countless feet, but it didn't appear on any map. Worse, it seemed to lead directly away from where Jason should have gone. I remembered Helen's protocols and backed away, but not before noticing something else. Footprints in the mud, small bare feet mixed with larger ones that showed the same claw marks I'd seen around my cabin. When additional searchers arrived that evening, I guided them to every legitimate trail in the area. We found no trace of Jason Winters. The new trail had vanished completely, leaving only undisturbed undergrowth where I'd seen it hours before. Jason's body was discovered 5 days later by hikers in a completely different section of the forest, nearly 15 miles from where he'd disappeared. The coroner ruled it death by exposure, but there were details that didn't add up. Jason was found in summer clothes despite freezing overnight temperatures. His feet were bare and cut, though his boots were never found. Most disturbing, his body showed signs of rapid decomposition despite the cold, as if he'd been dead for weeks rather than days. The family left immediately after claiming the body. As their car disappeared down the access road, I noticed Emma watching me through the rear window. Her expression was haunted, filled with knowledge no 15-year-old should possess. That night, I heard footsteps around my cabin again. This time, I was ready. I grabbed the shotgun and eased open the front door. Flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, tall, impossibly thin, wearing what looked like tattered clothing. It stood perfectly still, just beyond the reach of my light. "This is federal property," I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. "Identify yourself." The figure tilted its head at an unnatural angle, then smiled. I can't explain how I knew it was smiling from that distance, in that darkness, but I felt it like ice water in my veins. Then it was gone. Not running away, just gone, as if it had never been there. I stood in that doorway until dawn, shotgun ready, but nothing else appeared. When sunlight finally filtered through the trees, I found a single footprint in the dirt where the figure had stood, the same elongated shape with claw marks. But this print was fresh, still damp, and nearly 18 inches long. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Every few days, someone would disappear from Black Pine Forest. Hikers, campers, hunters, people who knew the wilderness and weren't prone to getting lost. Each time, I'd follow the same routine, search the conventional areas, find nothing, then watch as the body turned up days later in impossible locations. The disappearances always shared certain characteristics. Witnesses reported strange behavior before the person vanished, staring into the forest, talking about voices or being watched. The missing person would leave camp or their group, usually alone, often after dark. And each time, I'd find that impossible trail that would disappear before backup arrived. I started keeping detailed notes, documenting everything the official reports wouldn't include. Timestamps, weather conditions, exact locations of the vanishing trails. Most importantly, I began mapping the pattern of where bodies were found. What I discovered made me sick. The recovery sites formed a rough circle around a section of deep forest that I had never fully explored. Each location was exactly the same distance from a central point, about 12 miles from what my maps showed as Dead Man's Canyon, a deep ravine that supposedly had no trails leading to it. I requisitioned topographical surveys and historical records for that area. What I found was disturbing. Dead Man's Canyon wasn't named for any modern incident. The designation dated back to the 1800s, when fur trappers reported entire expeditions vanishing in that region. Native American tribes had avoided the area for generations, referring to it in their oral histories as the place where the hungry ones walk. The most chilling detail came from a 1923 geological survey. The team reported finding extensive cave systems and unusual geological formations in the canyon, along with evidence of human habitation dating back centuries. But when I tried to access their detailed findings, I discovered the files had been classified by the Department of the Interior. Classified geological surveys. Who classifies rocks and caves? That weekend, I decided to investigate Dead Man's Canyon myself. I loaded my pack with camping gear, emergency supplies, and every piece of recording equipment I could justify. If something was happening out there, I was going to document it properly. The hike to the canyon took most of the day. The forest grew progressively stranger as I went deeper. Trees twisted into unnatural shapes, clearings that were perfectly circular, and game trails that led nowhere. Twice I found what looked like Native American pictographs carved into rock faces. But the symbols didn't match any tribe I knew of. They depicted human figures with elongated limbs and animal heads, engaged in what looked like hunting or ritual activities. Dead Man's Canyon was everything the old reports described and worse. The ravine dropped nearly 200 feet into shadow so deep that my flashlight beam seemed to disappear into it. But what made my hands shake wasn't the depth, it was the structure. Someone had built a bridge across the canyon. Not a modern construction, but something ancient and wrong. It was made from what looked like animal bones held together with leather bindings, stretching from one rim to the other like a monstrous spinal column. I took photos, recorded GPS coordinates, and made detailed notes. But when I tried to radio headquarters, my equipment was completely dead. Not just poor reception, the radio was functioning perfectly, but headquarters didn't respond. It was as if the outside world simply didn't exist. As sunset approached, I set up camp on the canyon rim, positioned to observe the bridge while maintaining an escape route. I arranged my sleeping bag to face the structure, kept my shotgun within arm's reach, and settled in to wait. The first sign of activity came just after full darkness. Movement on the far side of the canyon, shapes emerging from cave openings I hadn't noticed during the day. They were human-like but wrong, moving with that same unnatural gait I'd glimpsed around my cabin. Through my binoculars, I watched them cross the bone bridge in single file. There were dozens of them, all tall and emaciated, wearing what looked like animal skins, but as they moved closer, I realized the skins were human clothing. Tattered hiking gear, camping clothes, park ranger uniforms, the clothing of everyone who disappeared. They moved with purpose, spreading out through the forest in a coordinated search pattern. I recognized it as a hunting formation, and I realized with growing horror that I was the prey. I abandoned my campsite immediately, grabbing only essential gear and moving as quietly as possible through the darkness. My plan was simple: reach the main trail and get back to radio range before whatever those things were could track me down. But the forest had changed. Trails I'd hiked for weeks led to dead ends or looped back on themselves. Familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by twisted rock formations and clearings that reeked of decay. My GPS showed impossible readings, coordinates that placed me hundreds of miles from where I should be. After 3 hours of futile navigation, I accepted the truth. I was trapped in whatever this place was. The normal rules of geography didn't apply here. I needed to find shelter and wait for dawn, hoping daylight would restore some semblance of reality. I chose a dense thicket of pine trees, crawling deep into the center where the branches would conceal me. From my hiding spot, I could see the bone bridge spanning the canyon about a quarter-mile away. The creatures were still crossing, an endless procession of impossible figures. That's when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. One of them was wearing my predecessor's uniform. I recognized the name tape, Hendrix, in faded letters across the chest. The thing wearing Tom's clothes moved with the same unnatural gait as the others, but its head turned toward my hiding spot with predatory awareness. It had found my scent. The Hendrix thing descended into the canyon and began moving in my direction. As it got closer, I could see more details through my binoculars, and each one was worse than the last. The face was wrong, stretched like taffy, with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. The hands were too long, ending in yellowed claws, and the mouth, God, the mouth was full of teeth that belonged in no human skull. But the worst part was that it still moved like Tom Hendrix. I'd studied footage of my predecessor during my orientation, and this thing had somehow absorbed his mannerisms along with his uniform. It walked with his slight limp, carried its left shoulder higher than the right, just like Tom did. It was wearing his identity like a costume. The thing reached the base of my hill and began climbing toward my hiding spot. I had two choices: run and be hunted in open ground, or make a stand in cover. I chose to fight. When the creature got within 50 feet, I opened fire. The shotgun blast echoed through the canyon and the thing dropped immediately. But instead of blood, thick black liquid poured from the wound. The smell was indescribable, like rotting meat mixed with sulfur and something else, something that made my primitive brain scream danger. More disturbing, the creature didn't die. It writhed on the ground, making sounds that were almost words, almost human language, but wrong in every way. The black fluid seemed to move independently, flowing back toward the wounds. I pumped another shell and fired again. This time the creature's head exploded in a spray of that same dark liquid. The body went still, but I could hear answering calls from the canyon. They'd heard the gunshots, they knew where I was. I ran. The chase lasted until dawn. Every time I thought I'd lost them, I'd hear that unnatural howling echoing through the trees. They moved faster than anything human should be able to, but they seemed reluctant to get too close. Maybe the shotgun had earned their respect, or maybe they were just playing with me. As the first rays of sunlight penetrated the forest canopy, the sounds of pursuit faded. I found myself standing on a familiar trail, the main hiking path that led back to headquarters. My GPS was working again, showing normal coordinates. The forest looked like a forest again, not the nightmare landscape I'd been trapped in. But when I looked back toward Dead Man's Canyon, I saw something that confirmed my worst fears. Smoke was rising from the ravine, not the gray smoke of a campfire, but thick black columns that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They were burning something, or someone. I made it back to my cabin just as Helen was organizing a search party. I'd been missing for 18 hours, though it felt like days. My equipment was covered in that same black substance, and my uniform was shredded in places I didn't remember damaging. "Where the hell have you been?" Helen demanded. I opened my mouth to tell her everything. The bone bridge, the creatures, the thing wearing Tom Hendrick's uniform. But looking at her face, I realized the truth. She already knew. The protocols, the warnings, the classified files. Helen knew exactly what was happening in Black Pine Forest. "Bears," I said finally. I was tracking the bears. 3 days after my escape from Dead Man's Canyon, Helen called me to her office. She'd received my incident report, a heavily edited version that mentioned aggressive wildlife but nothing supernatural. We both knew it was a lie. "Sit down, Marcus," she said, pouring 2 cups of coffee from a pot that had been brewing all day. "It's time we had a real conversation." The coffee was bitter and strong, but I welcomed the caffeine. I hadn't slept properly since returning from the canyon. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Every sound outside my cabin sent me reaching for the shotgun. "How long have you known?" I asked. Helen's smile was sad and tired. "About the skinwalkers? 23 years, that's when I took this job, and my predecessor gave me the same talk I'm about to give you." Skinwalkers. The word hit me like a physical blow. I'd researched Native American folklore extensively since my experience, and the descriptions matched perfectly. Shapeshifters, cannibals, dark shamans who'd sold their humanity for power. "They're not just legends," Helen continued. "The government has known about them since the Indian Wars. Special protocols exist for dealing with anomalous indigenous phenomena, though they don't call them skinwalkers in the official reports. Terms like hostile unknown biologics and domestic crypto entities sound better in Washington." She opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder marked "Classified, Eyes Only." Inside were dozens of incident reports dating back decades, all describing encounters similar to mine. Missing persons, unexplained deaths, sightings of impossible creatures. Black Pine sits on top of one of the largest concentrations of skinwalker activity in North America, Helen explained. "The canyon you found is their primary nesting site. They've been there for centuries, possibly longer. Early government surveys identified them as a persistent security threat, but elimination was deemed impossible." "So you just contain them?" "We manage them," Helen corrected. "The Forest Service maintains minimal staffing specifically to avoid drawing attention. We monitor their activity, document incidents, and ensure they don't spread beyond their established territory. It's not ideal, but it's worked for decades." I thought about all the people who disappeared, all the families destroyed by these things. "What about the victims?" Helen's expression hardened. "Acceptable losses. The alternative is public panic, military intervention, and the possibility of these things scattering across the entire region. At least contained here, we know where they are." "Tom Hendricks knew about this?" "Tom tried to do what you're thinking about doing. He thought he could fight them, expose them, save people." Helen pulled out another file, much thinner than the first. "This is what's left of Tom's final report." The pages were water damaged and partially illegible, but I could make out enough to understand. Tom had discovered the truth about Black Pine and tried to document everything. His final entry, dated the day before his transfer request, was barely readable. "They're not just killing people, they're converting them. The missing hikers, the other rangers, they're all still here, but they're not human anymore. I've seen them wearing familiar faces, heard them speaking in voices I recognize. We're not just feeding these things victims, we're providing them with new recruits." Tom became unstable, Helen said, taking the file back. "Started seeing threats everywhere. Couldn't distinguish between civilians and skinwalkers. He nearly shot a family of backpackers before we pulled him out." But I could see the truth in her eyes. Tom hadn't gone crazy. He'd figured out something Helen didn't want him to know. Something she didn't want me to know. "The replacement ranger," I said. "The one who disappeared 3 weeks into the job. He found out too, didn't he?" Helen didn't answer directly. "Sometimes people aren't suited for this kind of work. Sometimes they make poor decisions and wander off into dangerous areas. Sometimes they never come back. The implication was clear. I could accept the official story, follow protocols, and keep my mouth shut. Or I could end up like Tom's replacement, another mysterious disappearance in the Black Pine Forest incident files. What happens now? I asked. Now you decide what kind of ranger you want to be. You can stay, do your job, and help us maintain the status quo. The pay is good, the isolation is peaceful, and you'll be making a real contribution to national security. Or, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I spent that night staring at the ceiling, listening to footsteps circle my cabin. But this time, I didn't reach for the shotgun. I recognized the sound now. The same measured pace I'd heard my first night here. They'd been testing me from the beginning, seeing how I'd react. Whether I'd be another Tom Hendricks or just another compliant employee. When morning came, I made my decision. I submitted my transfer request that day, citing personal reasons. Helen approved it without question, though she made sure to remind me of the confidentiality agreements I'd signed. Some stories are better left untold, she said as I packed my truck. I left Black Pine Forest 3 days later, driving away from the most beautiful and terrifying place I'd ever seen. In my rearview mirror, I watched the tree line until it disappeared over a hill. For a moment, I thought I saw figures standing among the pines watching me go. That was 3 years ago. I've never returned to Montana, never spoken about what I experienced, never tried to contact Tom Hendricks or investigate what happened to the missing ranger. I work in an office building now, surrounded by people and noise and normalcy. But sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet, I hear footsteps outside my apartment. Slow, measured, circling. And I remember Helen's words, sometimes they never come back. The truth is, I don't think I ever really left Black Pine Forest. I think part of me is still there, still being hunted, still trying to escape something that doesn't understand the concept of mercy or boundaries. And sometimes, when I catch my reflection in dark windows, I wonder if the thing looking back at me is still entirely human. The footsteps are getting closer now, circling tighter. I can smell that sulfur and decay scent seeping under my door. Maybe it's time to stop running. Maybe it's time to go back to the woods where I belong. In the vast wilderness of the Olympic National Forest, there exists a silence that speaks volumes. It's a heavy quiet that weighs on your chest when you're alone among the ancient conifers. I've spent the better part of a decade as a ranger in this corner of Washington state, and I've come to understand the language of the forest, the way the wind moves differently when a storm approaches, how the birds fall silent when a predator is near. But there are times when the forest speaks in tongues I cannot decipher. My outpost sits near the boundary of the designated wilderness area, a modest 2-room cabin that serves as both home and headquarters during my 2-week rotations. The isolation never bothered me before. In fact, it was what drew me to the job after completing my degree in environmental science. The solitude was a balm for the chaos of modern life. The locals have their stories, of course. Every small town bordering wildlands does. Tales of strange calls echoing across the valleys at night, of massive footprints discovered in remote creek beds, of hikers who swear something large watched them from the tree line. I filed these away as folklore, the natural human tendency to populate the unknown with monsters. Until last October, the autumn had been unusually warm, drawing more visitors than typical for the season. Most were experienced hikers familiar with wilderness protocols, but occasionally we'd get the unprepared weekend warriors who underestimated the terrain and overestimated their abilities. I remember finishing my evening radio check-in with headquarters when the first call came through. A family of 4, about 3 miles from my position, reported hearing unusual vocalizations near their campsite. Nothing alarming, they emphasized, just strange enough to report. I logged it and promised to swing by during my morning patrol. That night, the forest fell into an unnatural silence. No owl hoots, no rustle of nocturnal creatures. Even the persistent whisper of wind through pine needles seemed to hold its breath. I sat on my cabin's porch, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold, staring into the darkness beyond the reach of my solar lamps. Something moved at the edge of the clearing, a shadow darker than the surrounding night. Too large for a deer, too silent for a bear. It stood upright, motionless, watching. I reached slowly for my flashlight, but by the time my fingers closed around it, the figure had melted back into the trees. I told myself it was exhaustion playing tricks, that the stories from town had planted seeds in my imagination. But deep down, in that primitive part of the brain that registers danger before conscious thought can form, I knew something had changed in my forest, and whatever it was, it had taken notice of me. The thing about working as a park ranger that most people don't realize is how much of the job involves listening. not just to radio calls or visitor questions, but to the environment itself. The sudden absence of birdsong can tell you more about what's lurking nearby than any trail camera. The morning after my strange encounter, I set out at dawn to check on the family who'd reported the unusual sounds. The air hung heavy with mist, limiting visibility and dampening sound. Perfect conditions for tracking, and for being tracked. About a mile from my cabin, I found the first prints. They crossed a muddy section of trail where a seasonal stream had overflowed its banks. At first glance, they resembled bear tracks, but something was off. The impression was too elongated, the stride too long. I knelt to examine them more closely, placing my hand beside one for scale. My palm and fingers barely covered half its length. I've read the scientific literature on misidentified bear prints, how a bear's front and back paws can overlap to create the illusion of a single, oversized humanoid foot. But these prints showed clear toe impressions, a distinct arch, and most disturbingly, they walked in a straight bipedal line. I took photographs and measurements, my ranger training temporarily overriding my unease. The family I was checking on had already packed up and left, according to another hiker I encountered. They'd apparently heard more whooping calls throughout the night and decided to cut their trip short. Back at my cabin that afternoon, I found myself pulling out an old dog-eared paperback from my shelf. Wilderness Encounters, a field guide to North American cryptids. It had been a gag gift from a fellow ranger years ago, but I'd kept it for its entertainment value during long, lonely evenings. The chapter on Sasquatch described behaviors consistent with what I was experiencing. Territory marking, vocalizations, observing humans from a distance before direct interaction. I caught myself and slammed the book shut. This was absurd. I was a scientifically trained professional, not some gullible cryptid hunter. There had to be rational explanations, a previously undocumented bear behavior perhaps, or even an elaborate hoax. That night, I left my audio recorder running outside the cabin. In the morning, I found it had captured nothing but the normal nocturnal forest sounds, until the 3:17 a.m. timestamp. There, in the static-filled silence, a low, rumbling vocalization that raised the hair on my neck. Not a bear, not a cougar, not any cataloged wildlife I recognized from my years of training. I sent the audio file to headquarters along with my track measurements, keeping my commentary strictly professional. The response came back within hours. Probable moose vocalization, tracks consistent with overlapping bear prints. Continue monitoring. They hadn't had a confirmed moose sighting in this region for over a decade, but I didn't argue. It was easier to accept their explanation than to consider the alternative. That evening, I found fresh tracks circling my cabin. A complete perimeter, methodical and deliberate. Whatever had made them had stood at each window, looking in. I've always considered fear to be a useful tool, an evolutionary alarm system honed by millennia of survival scenarios. But there's a difference between the sharp, clarifying fear of immediate danger and the slow, corrosive dread of being watched. By my 5th day of finding tracks around my cabin each morning, the latter had begun to wear on me. I found myself keeping my service pistol closer than regulations strictly advised, jumping at the natural creaks and groans of the aging structure, and sleeping in fitful bursts rather than restful stretches. The cabin itself had stood in this location for nearly 70 years, originally built as part of the Civilian Conservation Corps projects. Its logs had weathered to a silvery gray, and the interior smelled permanently of wood smoke and pine. Under normal circumstances, I found it comforting. Now its isolated position and numerous windows felt like vulnerabilities. During a supply run to the nearest town, I stopped at the local diner where rangers often gathered information not found in official reports. Martha, the owner who'd been serving coffee to Forest Service employees since before I was born, noticed my exhaustion immediately. "Something's got you spooked," she said, sliding a mug across the counter without being asked. I gave her a sanitized version of my experiences, careful to frame everything in terms of unusual wildlife behavior, rather than anything more fantastic. She listened without interruption, then disappeared into the back room. When she returned, she placed a worn hardcover book beside my coffee. "My late husband's," she explained. "He worked your section back in the 70s. Never talked much about his last season, but he kept this with him. Said it helped him understand." The book was The Hermit of the Woods by Theodore Blackwood, an obscure horror novel from the 1960s about a forest ranger who discovers a primitive humanoid species living in the deep wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. I thanked her, more out of politeness than interest, and slipped it into my pack. That night, unable to sleep, I began reading. The prose was dated but effective, describing the protagonist's gradual realization that the creatures he encountered were not simply animals but possessed a primitive intelligence and a territorial aggression toward human encroachment. What unsettled me most was the novel's description of their behavior, the systematic surveillance of human structures, the nocturnal vocalizations as communication, the deliberate track patterns identical to what I was experiencing. I was still reading at dawn when a frantic radio call broke my concentration. Two hikers had failed to check in at their designated time. Their last known position was approximately 4 miles northeast of my location, deep in the area where I'd been finding the strange tracks. As I geared up for search and rescue, I noticed something on my porch that hadn't been there the previous evening. A small arrangement of broken branches and stones in a distinct pattern. Not random debris blown by wind, but deliberately placed, almost like a primitive warning sign. I photographed it before heading out, trying to ignore the passage I'd just read in Blackwood's novel describing exactly such arrangements as territorial markers. The forest felt different that morning, tense, as if holding its breath. The normal wildlife sounds were present but subdued. As I moved deeper into the wilderness, following the missing hiker's registered route, the sensation of being observed intensified, not from any one direction, but from everywhere at once. Something was hunting in these woods, and I wasn't sure if I was the rescuer or simply the next target. Search and rescue operations in remote wilderness follow strict protocols designed to maximize efficiency while minimizing risk. As a solo ranger initiating the first phase of the search, my job was to check the most likely locations, shelters, trail junctions, and viewpoints where lost hikers might naturally gravitate. The missing pair were identified as Jason and Ellie Mercer, experienced backpackers in their mid-30s who had planned a 3-day loop through some of the more challenging terrain in my sector. Their emergency contact had received a text message the previous evening mentioning they were setting up camp early due to strange noises that had been following them throughout the day. The parallels to my own experiences sent a chill through me despite the exertion of hiking. I checked each designated campsite along their route, finding no sign until I reached a small clearing beside a stream about 6 miles in. There I discovered a campsite in disarray, a tent still standing but with one side collapsed, cooking equipment scattered, and a single boot abandoned beside the fire pit. The scene didn't match any typical wildlife encounter. Bears leave distinctive evidence: torn packs, claw marks, scattered food containers. This looked more like the campers had fled in panic, grabbing what they could in their haste. I documented everything according to procedure, then began establishing a search pattern outward from the site. That's when I noticed the broken branches, not random storm damage but systematic breaks at consistent heights along a clear path leading away from the camp. At intervals, I found more of the strange stone arrangements I'd seen on my porch. Following this trail, I pushed deeper into an area of old-growth forest rarely visited even by the most adventurous hikers. The canopy thickened overhead until only dappled light penetrated to the forest floor. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the undergrowth thinned, allowing for easier passage but also eliminating cover. 2 hours into this increasingly unsettling path, I heard it, a rhythmic thumping sound, like something solid striking wood. It came at regular intervals, 3 beats followed by a pause, then 3 more. Deliberate, communicative. I radioed my position to headquarters and described the potential contact, careful to use only official terminology. The static-filled response advised that a helicopter team was being assembled but was still 2 hours out. I was to continue cautious pursuit if I believed the hikers might be in immediate danger. The thumping stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I heard something much more chilling. A human voice, distant but distinct. "Help us! Oh God, please help!" Training took over. I marked my position and moved toward the voice, announcing my presence as a park ranger. The forest ahead opened into another clearing, smaller than the one with the campsite. At its center stood an ancient, massive cedar, its trunk at least 10 feet in diameter, and secured halfway up that trunk, bound with what looked like crude rope made from twisted bark, were the missing hikers. They were alive but terrified, suspended about 15 feet off the ground. Their climbing gear had been used against them, repurposed into restraints. When they saw me, their expressions shifted from hope to horror. "Behind you," the woman, Ellie, screamed. I turned, drawing my service weapon in one fluid motion, to face what I had been trying not to believe in for days. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown hair, its powerful body silhouetted against the forest I had just emerged from. The face was the most unsettling part. Not quite human, not quite ape, with deeply set eyes that reflected not animal instinct but calculated intelligence. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever name humanity had given it across centuries of fleeting encounters and dismissed testimonies, and it wasn't alone. Time seems to compress in moments of extreme danger, The 5 seconds I stood facing the creature stretched into what felt like minutes, each detail burning into my memory with hyper-real clarity. Its breathing came in deep, controlled rhythms. Its hands, larger than my face, hung at its sides, fingers curled but not clenched. The eyes, amber brown with vertical pupils like a goat's, held mine with unmistakable assessment. This wasn't a chance meeting between species. It had led me here deliberately. Behind me, the Mercers had fallen silent, their earlier panic replaced by a primal stillness, the instinctive response of prey hoping to avoid notice. But we were well beyond that point. We had been noticed, cataloged, and corralled exactly where the creatures wanted us. I say creatures because my peripheral vision caught movement on both sides. At least 2 more figures moving with surprising grace through the underbrush, circling to cut off any retreat. They communicated through a series of low grunts and those same rhythmic wood knocks I'd heard earlier. My ranger training offered no protocol for this situation. My scientific background rebelled against what my senses were reporting, but survival instinct recognized the immediate threat regardless of its taxonomic classification. "I'm here to help these people," I said, keeping my voice steady, broadcasting calm authority through my body language. "They need to return to their families." The creature's head tilted slightly, a disconcertingly human gesture of consideration. Then it raised one massive arm and pointed directly at the ancient backpack hanging from my shoulder, the same pack containing Blackwood's novel about forest creatures defending their territory against human encroachment. A coincidence, surely. It couldn't possibly know. The creature took a deliberate step forward, and I raised my weapon instinctively. Its lips pulled back from yellowed teeth in what might have been a smile or a threat display. When it vocalized, the sound vibrated through my chest cavity, a series of deep whoops followed by a sustained, modulating howl that echoed through the clearing. From the forest came answering calls. Not 2 or 3, but many. Far more than I had initially suspected. "They've been herding people away from something deeper in the forest," Ellie called down from her position in the tree. "We found structures, complex ones. Then they started hunting us." The revelation hit like ice water. Not random encounters, but a systematic defense of territory, exactly as Blackwood's novel had described. Had the author known something? Had Martha's husband encountered these creatures during his time as a ranger? The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the distant thrum of helicopter rotors approaching from the south. The sound triggered an immediate reaction. The lead creature threw its head back in another powerful howl, then turned and melted into the forest with shocking speed. Its companions followed, their departure as silent as their arrival had been deliberate. I kept my weapon raised until I was certain they were gone, then immediately began climbing to free the Mercers. As I worked to release them, Ellie described how they'd been stalked for miles before being ambushed and carried, semi-conscious, to this location. "They could have killed us at any time," Jason said, rubbing circulation back into his wrists, "but they seemed more interested in studying us. One of them took our camera and just examined it for hours, pressing the buttons, looking at the screen. By the time the rescue helicopter located our position, we had made it back to the original campsite. I reported finding the hikers disoriented but unharmed, making no mention of what we'd actually encountered. Some truths are too disturbing to enter official records, at least not without irrefutable evidence. That night, returning to my cabin after debriefing, I found all my windows shattered and a clear message left on my table. Blackwood's novel, torn apart page by page and arranged in a spiral pattern. In the center lay a small carved wooden figure of a ranger's cabin. 3 days after the rescue, I submitted my request for transfer. Not out of fear, though that would have been reasonable, but out of a growing conviction that my presence was exacerbating a delicate situation. The territorial displays had escalated with each confrontation. If the pattern continued, someone would eventually die. Headquarters approved my transfer with surprising speed. Perhaps they'd noted the inconsistencies in my reports, or perhaps other rangers had filed similar observations over the years, creating an unspoken institutional knowledge about certain areas best left understaffed. Before leaving, I made one final journey, not into the territory where I'd encountered the creatures, but to Martha's diner in town. I returned Blackwood's novel, or what remained of it, and told her everything. She listened without surprise, then reached beneath the counter and pulled out a battered journal. "My Williams," she explained. "He wanted it burned after his death, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Maybe you'll understand it better than I did." The journal detailed a series of encounters remarkably similar to mine, culminating in William discovering what appeared to be a primitive settlement deep in the old-growth forest, structures woven from living trees and undergrowth, evidence of tool use, even crude symbolic markings on stone and wood. His final entry, dated October 1978, read simply, "They are not animals to be managed or specimens to be studied. They are the true stewards of this wilderness. We are the intruders. I've reached an understanding with them, boundaries that must not be crossed by either side. This knowledge dies with me." Yet here I was, holding that very knowledge, faced with the same decision. The scientific community would demand evidence, leading to expeditions, intrusions, and inevitable conflict. The public would react with either disbelief or panic. Neither response would serve the forest or its most secretive inhabitants. I returned to my cabin one last time to collect my personal belongings. The broken windows had been repaired, not by rangers but by crude wooden shutters fashioned from forest materials. Inside, everything remained as I'd left it, except for a new arrangement on the table. Pine needles, small stones, and twigs formed into a pattern that roughly approximated the boundaries of the park. A line of red berries marked the edge of their territory. A small carved figure, unmistakably meant to represent me, stood on the human side of that boundary. The message couldn't have been clearer. Stay within your realm and we will stay within ours. I've honored that agreement in the 5 years since, working now as a ranger in a different national forest 3 states away. I've told no one else what I encountered, though I've recognized the signs in other rangers' hesitant descriptions of certain wilderness areas they prefer to avoid. Sometimes at night, when the forest falls into that particular quality of silence I now recognize, I wonder if they're out there in these woods too, watching, evaluating, defending boundaries invisible to most human eyes. The thought no longer frightens me as it once did. There are wilderness spaces on this continent that still hold mysteries science hasn't cataloged. Perhaps some mysteries deserve to remain unclassified, undisturbed, respected rather than resolved. If you're reading this and recognize something familiar in your own experiences in the deep woods, know that you're not crazy, but also understand the responsibility that comes with such knowledge. Some stories aren't meant to be shared beyond a whisper. Some territories aren't meant to be claimed, and some boundaries, once understood, must be honored by both sides.